Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through one of the most remarkable stories in Anglo-Saxon England, the tale of a king who valued books over battles, chose monasteries over palaces, and ultimately gave his life carrying nothing but a simple staff. We'll softly explore the extraordinary life of Sigeberht of East Anglia, from his scholarly exile in Gaul to his revolutionary work bringing education and Christianity to his kingdom, and finally to his ultimate sacrifice as a warrior monk who refused to abandon his principles even in death. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Even if you're feeling a little shy, just drop a simple word, an emoji, or tell me what historical period you'd love to hear about next. Your gentle presence means everything to our cozy community here. And if these soothing historical tales help carry you to sleep, a quiet like and subscribe would truly warm my heart. We're all one big sleepy family here at Sleepy Crown. So settle in comfortably, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from 7th century England lull you into the most restful sleep. If you're new to our peaceful circle, welcome home, dear dreamer. Sigeberht, later known as Saint Sigeberht of East Anglia, was perhaps the most unusual king who ever lived. In an age when rulers were expected to be warriors first and everything else second, here was a man who valued wisdom over warfare, chose scholarship over the sword, and ultimately abandoned his throne not for another crown, but for the quiet walls of a monastery. But to understand this remarkable soul, we must first journey back to the misty shores of 7th century East Anglia, where the North Sea whispers against ancient coastlands, and where a dynasty called the Wulfingers, the Wolf Kings, had carved out one of the most powerful realms in early England. The kingdom of East Anglia stretched across what we now know as Norfolk and Suffolk, a land of rolling hills, dense forests, and winding rivers that carried both trade goods and whispered secrets from the wider world. Here, where Roman roads still bore the footprints of legions long departed, Anglo-Saxon settlers had built something entirely new, a kingdom that would become a bridge between the pagan past and the Christian future. The Wulfingers took their name from Wulfa, a semi-legendary king whose very name meant little wolf. Like their totemic animal, the Wolf Kings of East Anglia were known for their cunning, their unity, and their remarkable ability to survive in a world where kingdoms rose and fell with the turning of seasons. The wolf was more than just a symbol to them. It was a spiritual guide, a connection to the other world, and a reminder that survival often required both fierce independence and loyal pack bonds. By the time our story begins, in the early decades of the 600s, the greatest of all the Wolf Kings had already left his mark upon the land. King Redwald, Sigeberht's father, or perhaps stepfather, had been what the Anglo-Saxons called a breadwalder, an overlord whose power extended far beyond his own kingdom's boundaries. From his royal halls at Rendlesham, near the mystical burial grounds of Sutton Hoo, Redwald had commanded the respect and tribute of kings across southern England. The great ship burial at Sutton Hoo, discovered centuries later by archaeologists, likely commemorates this mighty king. Beneath an earthen mound, a ghost ship carried treasures fit for Valhalla: golden helmet with boar crest, jeweled sword pommel, silver dishes from Byzantium, and coins that spoke of trade networks stretching across the known world. It was a burial that spoke of immense wealth, sophisticated culture, and connections that spanned continents. But Redwald's kingdom was balanced on a knife's edge between two worlds. While he had accepted Christian baptism at the court of King Ethelbert of Kent, he had never fully abandoned the old gods. Bede, the great chronicler of these times, wrote with evident disapproval that Redwald maintained altars to both Christ and Woden in the same temple, a spiritual hedging of bets that seemed practical to a king, but scandalous to Christian monks. This religious ambiguity created deep tensions within the royal family and the kingdom at large. The old nobility, warriors who traced their lineages back to the first Saxon settlers, remained largely faithful to Thor and Woden, to the warrior gods who had carried their ancestors across the North Sea. But a new generation, influenced by Christian missionaries and the wealth of Christian kingdoms, began to see a different path forward. Into this complex world, sometime around the year 610 or 615, was born the child who would become known as Sigeberht. His very name, meaning bright victory, seemed to prophesy the unique triumphs that would define his reign. Victories not of sword and shield, but of mind and spirit. The exact circumstances of Sigebert's birth remain shrouded in the gentle mists of early medieval history. Some scholars believe he was Redwald's youngest son, a prince born late in the great king's life when thoughts had already begun to turn toward legacy and the world beyond. Others suggest he was a stepson, the child of one of Redwald's wives from a previous marriage, possibly to a princess from the kingdom of Essex. This uncertainty about his exact parentage would prove crucial to Sigebert's early life. In Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, succession was never automatically guaranteed to the eldest son. Kings could choose their heirs from among all eligible male relatives, sons, brothers, nephews, even stepsons. This system, while allowing for the selection of capable rulers, also created endless opportunities for conflict and intrigue. As young Sigeberht grew from child to youth in the royal halls of Rendlesham, he would have witnessed the daily complexities of ruling a kingdom caught between worlds. Christian priests would have shared the great hall with pagan wise men. Latin manuscripts might sit beside rune-carved staves. The smell of incense could mingle with the smoke of sacrificial fires. The boy, who would become the scholar king, was growing up in what was essentially a living laboratory of cultural fusion, where Roman learning met Germanic warrior culture, where Christian theology encountered ancient Norse wisdom, where the written word was beginning to challenge the supremacy of oral tradition. But this world of his childhood was not destined to last. Great changes were stirring across the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, changes that would transform not just East Anglia, but the entire future of what would become England. Exile and education in Gaul. The peaceful rhythms of Sigebert's youth were shattered sometime around 627, when the delicate balance of power within the Wulfinger dynasty finally collapsed. King Redwald had died around 624, leaving behind a kingdom that was wealthy and powerful, but deeply divided about its future direction. The crown initially passed to Eorwald, Sigebert's older brother or stepbrother, a man who seemed ready to bridge the gap between the old ways and the new. Eorwald had been baptized as a Christian, following in the footsteps of his father's official conversion, but unlike Redwald, he appeared committed to fully embracing the new faith. For a brief moment, it seemed as though East Anglia might peacefully transition from its pagan past to a Christian future. Churches began to appear alongside the ancient sacred groves. Christian prayers echoed in halls that had once resounded with the old warrior songs. The kingdom's trade relationships with Christian realms across the Channel grew stronger and more profitable. But this hopeful beginning was brutally cut short. In what must have been a carefully planned coup, a pagan nobleman named Sigeberht struck down King Eorwald, probably sometime in 627. The assassination was swift, violent and effective. Within a single night, East Anglia's experiment with Christian kingship appeared to be over. Sigebert's motives were almost certainly religious as well as political. He represented the old guard, the warriors and nobles, who saw Christianity not as a path to salvation, but as a threat to their ancestral ways. The Christian emphasis on peace, forgiveness, and turning the other cheek seemed incompatible with the warrior values that had built their kingdom. Moreover, Christian kings often favored Christian advisors, potentially displacing the pagan priests and wise men who had traditionally counseled Anglo-Saxon rulers. In the chaos that followed Eopwald's murder, young Sigeberht found himself in mortal danger. As a member of the royal family and a potential rallying point for those who opposed Rigbert's coup, he was marked for death. The same forces that had killed his brother would not hesitate to eliminate any other potential claimants to the throne. But Sigeberht had allies, Christian nobles and merchants who had prospered under Redwold's relatively tolerant policies, and who now saw their own futures threatened by Rigbert's pagan restoration. Working in secret, probably in the dead of night, they spirited the young prince away from East Anglia entirely. The escape route led across the North Sea to the Frankish kingdoms of Gaul, where Christianity had not only taken root, but was flourishing under royal patronage. Here, in the courts of Christian kings and the scriptoriums of great monasteries, Sigeberht would spend the next several years of his life, years that would fundamentally shape the man he would become. The Frankish kingdoms of the early 7th century represented Christianity at its most sophisticated and culturally ambitious. Unlike the relatively recent Christian converts of England, the Franks had been Christian for over a century, long enough to develop a rich fusion of Roman learning, Germanic culture, and Christian theology. Young Sigeberht was almost certainly placed in one of the great monastic schools that were beginning to dot the Frankish landscape. These institutions, inspired by the rule of St. Benedict and supported by royal patronage, were becoming centers of learning that preserved and transmitted the intellectual heritage of the classical world. In these peaceful halls, surrounded by the gentle scratch of pens on parchment and the soft murmur of Latin prayers, Sigeberht discovered a world entirely different from the warrior culture of his birth. Here, victory was measured not in battles won, but in souls saved. Power came not from the strength of one's sword arm, but from the depth of one's wisdom. Glory was found not in the great hall's gift-giving, but in the quiet contemplation of divine mysteries. The curriculum that shaped young Sigeberht's mind would have begun with the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, the foundation of all medieval education. He would have learned to read and write Latin with fluency, to pass complex theological arguments, and to construct persuasive speeches. But beyond these practical skills, he was being initiated into an entirely different way of understanding the world. Classical authors like Virgil, Ovid, and Cicero opened windows onto the grandeur of Roman civilization. Christian theologians like Augustine, Jerome, and Gregory the Great revealed the intellectual depths of the faith. Historical chronicles showed him how kingdoms rose and fell, how leaders succeeded or failed, and how the hand of providence moved through human affairs. Perhaps most importantly, Sigeberht was learning to see kingship itself in an entirely new light. In pagan Germanic culture, kings were primarily war leaders, men chosen for their ability to win battles and distribute treasure to their followers. But Christian political theology offered a radically different model. The king as God's representative on earth, responsible not just for military victory, but for the spiritual and moral welfare of his people. This concept of sacred kingship would have appealed powerfully to a young man who possessed both royal blood and an increasingly scholarly temperament. It offered a way to reconcile his inherited position with his growing love of learning and contemplation. A Christian king, unlike a pagan war leader, was expected to be wise as well as strong, learned as well as brave. The years of exile were passing, and with each season, Sigeberht was growing not just in knowledge but in spiritual maturity. He was becoming fluent in the languages of power: Latin for learning and diplomacy, Greek for theological sophistication, and the various Frankish tongues for practical communication. But more than that, he was developing the intellectual framework that would guide his eventual return to East Anglia. Reports from his homeland were sparse but disturbing. Under Rigbert's rule, East Anglia was sliding backward into isolation and stagnation. The profitable trade relationships with Christian kingdoms were withering. The tentative steps toward literacy and learning that had begun under Redwald were being reversed. The kingdom that had once been a bridge between worlds was becoming a backwater. But perhaps most troubling of all, from Sigebert's Christian perspective, was the spiritual condition of his people. 3 years under pagan rule had undone much of the missionary work that had begun under his predecessors. Churches were abandoned or converted back to pagan shrines. Christian priests fled or went into hiding. The people who had begun to hear the gospel message were left spiritually adrift. As Sigeberht entered his early 20s, still in exile but now a fully formed adult, he began to receive messages from supporters back home. Rigbert's rule was proving unpopular, not just with Christians, but with many pagans as well. The kingdom's declining fortunes were being attributed to the gods' displeasure, and whispers were growing that perhaps the old bloodline should be restored. These were dangerous thoughts to express openly, but they reached Sigeberht through a network of merchants, monks, and nobles who maintained secret communications across the channel. The message was becoming clear. If he were willing to return, and if he were willing to risk everything in a bid for his rightful throne, he would not be without allies. The decision that faced Sigeberht was one of the most momentous in Anglo-Saxon history. He could remain safely in Gaul, perhaps eventually taking monastic vows and living out his days as a scholar monk. Or he could return to claim his inheritance, knowing that success would bring not just a crown, but the opportunity to transform his kingdom in ways that had never been attempted before. The young man, who had entered exile as a frightened prince, was now ready to return as something unprecedented in Anglo-Saxon England. A king educated in Christian learning, trained in classical rhetoric, and committed to a vision of rulership that would revolutionize not just his own kingdom, but the entire future of English civilization. Chaos in East Anglia, while Sigeberht pursued his scholarly education in the monasteries and courts of Gaul, his homeland of East Anglia was experiencing a gradual but unmistakable decline under the rule of Rigbert, the pagan nobleman who had seized power through the assassination of King Eobwald. The early years of Rigbert's reign might have seemed superficially successful to those who favoured a return to the old ways. The Christian priests who had begun to appear in East Anglian villages during Eobwald's brief reign either fled across the channel or retreated into hiding. The churches that had been under construction were abandoned, their stones often repurposed for more practical buildings. The sacred groves and springs that had been neglected during the kingdom's Christian phase once again became centres of religious activity. Rigbert himself appears to have been a genuinely devout pagan, not merely someone using religious reaction as a path to political power. Archaeological evidence from this period suggests a deliberate revival of traditional Anglo-Saxon religious practices. Elaborate grave goods reappeared in burial sites, suggesting a renewed belief in the afterlife journey to the warrior halls of the gods. Sacred symbols associated with Woden, Thuna, and other Germanic deities began appearing again on jewelry, weapons, and ceremonial objects. But beneath this surface return to tradition, deeper problems were emerging that threatened the very foundations of East Anglian prosperity and security. The most immediate challenge was diplomatic. During the reigns of Redwald and Eobwald, East Anglia had built profitable relationships with the increasingly powerful Christian kingdoms surrounding it. Kent, under its Christian kings, had become a crucial trading partner, providing access to Frankish goods and continental markets. Northumbria, particularly after the conversion and rise of King Edwin, had offered valuable military alliances and shared intelligence about common threats. Rigbert's pagan restoration effectively severed these relationships. Christian kings were reluctant to make treaties with pagan rulers, not just for religious reasons, but for practical ones as well. Pagan kings were seen as less reliable partners, more likely to break oaths, and generally less bound by the elaborate codes of Christian diplomatic conduct that were beginning to govern inter-kingdom relations. The economic consequences were swift and severe. Trade goods that had flowed freely into East Anglia during the Christian period, wine from Gaul, silk from Byzantium, silver from the Rhine, began to find other routes to market. East Anglian merchants found themselves shut out of the profitable Christian trading networks that were transforming the economy of early medieval Europe. Perhaps more seriously, East Anglia was becoming isolated from the technological and intellectual innovations that were spreading rapidly through Christian Europe. The art of writing, which had begun to take root during Redwald's reign, was particularly affected. Without Christian monks to maintain scriptoriums, and without diplomatic correspondence to require written records, literacy rates in East Anglia began to decline. This intellectual isolation was particularly damaging to the kingdom's administrative capabilities. While neighboring Christian kingdoms were developing increasingly sophisticated systems of government, written laws, recorded land grants, formal diplomatic protocols, East Anglia was reverting to older, less efficient methods of governance based primarily on personal relationships and oral agreements. The military consequences were even more alarming. During his years of power, Redwald had maintained East Anglia's position as a major military force, largely through careful alliance building and diplomatic maneuvering. He had avoided costly wars by building a network of relationships that made other kingdoms reluctant to attack East Anglia and eager to call upon East Anglian support for their own military ventures. Rigbert lacked both the diplomatic skill and the religious connections to maintain these relationships. Worse, his pagan restoration was creating active hostility among neighbouring Christian rulers, who increasingly saw East Anglia not as a potential ally, but as a threat to the spread of Christianity in Britain. The most dangerous of these hostile neighbours was rapidly emerging as Penda of Mercia, a brilliant military strategist who combined pagan religious fervour with sophisticated tactical thinking. Unlike Rigbert, whose paganism seemed largely defensive and traditional, Penda appeared to see his pagan faith as a positive force for expansion and conquest. From his power base in the English Midlands, Penda was systematically challenging the authority of Christian kingdoms throughout Britain. He had already demonstrated his military capabilities by participating in the defeat and death of Edwin of Northumbria in 633, and he was clearly looking for additional opportunities to expand Mercian power at the expense of his neighbours. East Anglia, isolated and weakened by years of diplomatic neglect, must have appeared to Penda as an attractive target. The kingdom retained much of the wealth that had been accumulated during Redwald's successful reign, but it lacked the military alliances that had once made it too dangerous to attack. But perhaps the most serious problem facing Rigbert's East Anglia was internal. The pagan restoration had not been universally popular, even among those who had never converted to Christianity. Many East Anglians had prospered during the kingdom's Christian phase and were unhappy to see those opportunities disappearing. Merchants who had built their fortunes on trade with Christian kingdoms found their businesses struggling. Artisans who had learned new techniques from Christian craftsmen saw their skills becoming less valued. More fundamentally, many East Anglians had come to question whether the old gods were truly capable of protecting their kingdom in this new world, of larger, more sophisticated political entities. The traditional Germanic pantheon had been designed for tribal societies where the primary concerns were local warfare, seasonal agriculture, and clan relationships. But 7th century Britain was becoming something entirely different, a land of kingdoms that maintained diplomatic relations across hundreds of miles, engaged in international trade, and faced military threats that required coordinated responses involving thousands of warriors. Christian kingdoms seemed better adapted to these new realities. Their God appeared to offer protection on a scale that matched the challenges of the age. Their priests could read and write, maintaining the records necessary for complex administration. Their diplomatic networks provided early warning of threats and access to military allies when needed. By the late 620s, probably around 629 or 630, these various pressures were creating a crisis of confidence in Rigbert's leadership. The signs were subtle at first, perhaps a decline in the enthusiasm of the annual assemblies where the king met with his nobles, or a reluctance among the wealthy to contribute to royal building projects, but they were unmistakable to anyone familiar with the rhythms of Anglo-Saxon political life. Secret meetings were beginning to occur in the halls of nobles who had remained loyal to the memory of Redwald and Eopwald. Merchants were quietly discussing the kingdom's declining fortunes. Even some pagan priests were beginning to wonder whether the gods might be better served by a return to the policies that had brought East Anglia prosperity and security. Most significantly, messages were beginning to cross the channel to the Frankish kingdoms, seeking out the exiled prince whose education was now complete and whose claim to the throne remained legally valid according to Anglo-Saxon custom. The stage was being set for one of the most remarkable royal restorations in early medieval history, the return of the scholar king, whose vision of Christian learning and enlightened governance would transform not just East Anglia, but the entire future of English civilization. The scholar's crown, the autumn mist that rolled in from the North Sea in the year 630, carried with them whispers of change that would echo through the halls of East Anglian nobility. Somewhere across the dark waters of the Channel, supporters of the exiled Prince Sigeberht were putting into motion a plan that had been years in the making. The conspiracy that would restore the rightful heir to the East Anglian throne was necessarily a delicate affair, involving a complex network of nobles, merchants, Christian sympathizers, and even some pagan leaders who had grown disillusioned with Rigbert's increasingly isolated rule. Communication had to be maintained in absolute secrecy, using coded messages carried by seemingly innocent travelers, pilgrims visiting continental shrines, merchants conducting routine business, or diplomatic envoys whose true mission remained hidden beneath official pretenses. The plan that emerged from these clandestine meetings was as sophisticated as it was dangerous. Rather than attempting a direct military invasion, which would have been costly and might have failed against Rigbert's still formidable forces, Sigebert's supporters chose a strategy that played to their candidate's greatest strengths: his legitimacy, his education, and his ability to offer a compelling vision of East Anglia's future. The first phase involved carefully preparing public opinion for Sigebert's return. Stories began circulating about the young prince's remarkable education in Gaul, his fluency in Latin, his connections with powerful Christian kingdoms, and most importantly, his commitment to restoring East Anglia to its former prosperity and influence. These stories passed from village to village through the informal networks that connected Anglo-Saxon communities, gradually built a sense of anticipation and hope. Simultaneously, Rigbert's failures were being quietly highlighted and discussed. The decline in trade, the loss of diplomatic influence, the growing threats from neighboring kingdoms. all were attributed to the current king's inability to navigate the complex realities of 7th century political life. The implicit message was clear. East Anglia needed a ruler capable of engaging successfully with the wider Christian world. By the spring of 631, conditions were judged ready for Sigebert's return. The logistics of getting him safely from Gaul to East Anglia without alerting Rigbert's agents required careful coordination, but the same merchant networks that had maintained communication were also capable of providing transportation. The journey itself must have been both exhilarating and terrifying for the young man, who had spent so many years dreaming of this moment. As his ship crossed the familiar waters of the North Sea, Sigeberht would have seen the coastline of his homeland appearing through the morning mist, the same beaches where his ancestors had first landed as pagan warriors, the same cliffs that had witnessed the rise of the Wulfinger dynasty. But the man returning to claim his throne was fundamentally different from any ruler East Anglia had ever known. Where previous kings had been primarily warriors, Sigeberht was primarily a scholar. Where they had relied on oral tradition and personal charisma, he brought the sophisticated intellectual tools of continental Christianity. Where they had governed through personal relationships and tribal custom, he possessed knowledge of Roman law and Christian political theory. The actual restoration appears to have happened with remarkable speed and surprisingly little bloodshed. Rigbert, isolated by his policies and facing defection among his own supporters, was unable to mount effective resistance when Sigebert's supporters declared their allegiance to the returning prince. The details of Rigbert's end remain unclear. Anglo-Saxon chronicles were often deliberately vague about such matters, preferring to emphasize the restoration of legitimate rule rather than dwell on the violence that might have been necessary to achieve it. He may have died in battle, been executed for treason, or simply fled into exile himself. What matters more for our story is that by the summer of 631, Sigeberht was firmly established as the rightful king of East Anglia, but the new king's first major decision revealed both his political wisdom and his understanding of the complex religious and cultural divisions within his kingdom. Rather than attempting to rule alone, as Anglo-Saxon kings traditionally did, Sigeberht chose to share power with a kinsman named Egric, who appears to have represented the more traditional, possibly still pagan elements of East Anglian society. This arrangement of dual kingship was not entirely unprecedented in Anglo-Saxon England. Kingdoms like Kent and Northumbria had occasionally been divided between co-rulers, but Sigebert's motivations were probably more sophisticated than simple political expediency. By sharing power with Egric, he was demonstrating that his Christian vision for East Anglia did not require the complete suppression of traditional values and customs. The division of authority seems to have been both geographical and functional. Sigeberht, with his Christian education and diplomatic connections, took primary responsibility for relations with neighboring kingdoms, religious affairs, and the development of new institutions like schools and monasteries. Egric, who appears to have remained pagan throughout his life, maintained authority over military matters, relations with traditional noble families, and the preservation of customary law. This careful balancing act allowed Sigeberht to begin implementing his revolutionary vision for East Anglia without provoking the kind of religious backlash that had destroyed his brother Eobald's reign. Christians could see that their faith was being actively promoted and supported, while pagans could observe that their king had not simply abandoned the old ways, but was incorporating them into a larger, more comprehensive approach to governance. The early months of Sigebert's reign were marked by intense diplomatic activity as the new king worked to restore East Anglia's position in the complex network of relationships that connected the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Messages were sent to Kent, announcing the restoration of Christian rule and requesting renewed trade relationships. Similar communications went to Northumbria, seeking military alliance against the growing threat of Penda's Mercia. Perhaps most importantly, Sigeberht sent emissaries across the Channel to his former hosts in Gaul, not just to express gratitude for their support during his years of exile, but to request assistance in his most ambitious project, the systematic Christianization and education of his kingdom. The response to these diplomatic overtures was overwhelmingly positive. Christian kings throughout Britain and Gaul welcomed the restoration of a ruler who could serve as a reliable ally and trading partner. More practically, they were eager to support Sigeberht's plans for establishing Christianity in East Anglia, both for religious reasons and because Christian kingdoms tended to be more stable and predictable partners in international affairs. By the end of his first year as king, Sigeberht had succeeded in restoring East Anglia's diplomatic position and beginning the careful work of religious and cultural transformation that would define his reign. But the most dramatic changes were still to come, as the scholar king prepared to welcome to his court two remarkable men whose collaboration would revolutionize not just East Anglia, but the entire future of English Christianity and education. The stage was set for one of the most remarkable partnerships in early medieval history, the alliance between a king who valued learning above warfare and the missionary saints who would help him create the first truly literate Christian society in Anglo-Saxon England. The Great Christian Transformation. As the second year of Sigeberht's restoration dawned with the gentle warmth of spring 632, momentous events were taking shape that would forever alter the spiritual and intellectual landscape of East Anglia. Across the Channel in Burgundy, a remarkable priest named Felix was preparing to answer a call that would make him one of the most influential figures in early English Christianity. Felix was no ordinary missionary. Born and ordained in the sophisticated Christian culture of Burgundy, he had grown up in a world where Christianity had long since moved beyond mere survival to become the foundation of an entire civilization. The monasteries of Gaul were centers not just of worship, but of learning, preserving and transmitting the intellectual heritage of both classical antiquity and Christian theology. What made Felix particularly suited for the mission to East Anglia was his deep understanding of both Roman and Celtic Christian traditions. Burgundy had been a crossroads of religious influence, where the organizational efficiency of Roman Christianity met the mystical fervor of Celtic monasticism, brought by Irish missionaries like Saint Columbanus. This synthesis had produced a uniquely sophisticated form of Christianity that combined institutional stability with spiritual depth. When Archbishop Honorius of Canterbury received Felix's request to undertake missionary work among the Anglo-Saxons, he recognized an exceptional opportunity. Here was a man with the theological education to engage with learned pagans, the organizational skills to establish lasting institutions, and the diplomatic experience to work effectively with royal courts. The meeting between Felix and King Sigeberht, which probably took place in the late summer of 632, must rank as one of the most significant encounters in early English history. Here were two men whose backgrounds could hardly have been more different. One a continental priest steeped in centuries of Christian learning, the other an Anglo-Saxon king who had only recently reclaimed his throne, yet who shared a remarkably similar vision of what Christianity could accomplish in the right circumstances. Felix would have been impressed by Sigeberht's fluency in Latin, his familiarity with Christian theology, and his sophisticated understanding of how religious change could be managed without provoking destructive social upheaval. Sigeberht, for his part, would have recognized in Felix exactly the kind of learned, experienced collaborator he needed to implement his ambitious plans for transforming East Anglia. The agreement they reached would have far-reaching consequences that neither could have fully anticipated. Felix would become East Anglia's first bishop, with authority to establish churches, ordain priests, and organize the systematic evangelization of the kingdom. But unlike many missionary bishops, who focused primarily on conversion and basic religious instruction, Felix was also charged with a more ambitious mandate: the establishment of schools and the promotion of literacy among the Anglo-Saxon population. The site chosen for Felix's episcopal seat was Dommoc, a location that remains debated by historians, but was probably either the thriving port town of Dunwich or the strategically located Roman fort at Walton Castle near modern Felixstowe. The choice of location was significant in itself. Rather than establishing his headquarters in the traditional royal centres of Rendlesham or Sutton Hoo, Felix was creating an independent base of operations that emphasized the church's institutional autonomy, while remaining easily accessible to royal support. The construction of the cathedral at Dommoc began almost immediately, and the building that rose from the East Anglian landscape was unlike anything the kingdom had seen before. While maintaining some elements of traditional Anglo-Saxon architecture, the steep pitched roof, the heavy timber construction, the cathedral incorporated distinctly Christian elements that proclaimed its sacred purpose to anyone who approached. The interior was particularly revolutionary. Where Anglo-Saxon great halls had been designed to showcase the wealth and power of earthly kings, the cathedral was organized around an entirely different set of priorities. The altar, not the throne, occupied the position of greatest honor. The walls, instead of displaying weapons and war trophies, were adorned with religious art that told the stories of Christian salvation. But Felix's most important innovation was not architectural, but educational. Working closely with King Sigeberht, he established the first school in Anglo-Saxon England, designed specifically to teach reading and writing to lay people, not just future priests. The model for this revolutionary institution came from the monastic schools that Felix had known in Gaul, but it was adapted to meet the specific needs of Anglo-Saxon society. The curriculum began with basic Latin literacy, the ability to read religious texts and write simple documents, but it quickly expanded to include more advanced studies in theology, history, and even elements of classical literature that were deemed compatible with Christian teaching. The teachers for this school came from various sources, but many were provided by Archbishop Honorius from Canterbury, demonstrating the broader support that Sigeberht's educational experiment enjoyed throughout Christian Britain. These men were not just scholars, but also experienced educators who understood how to adapt continental teaching methods to the very different cultural context of newly converted Anglo-Saxons. The impact of this school extended far beyond the small number of students who could actually attend. As young East Anglians mastered reading and writing, they carried these skills back to their home communities, where they could teach others and serve as scribes for local administrative needs. For the first time in Anglo-Saxon history, literacy was beginning to spread beyond the clergy into the general population. The changes were not merely educational, but deeply cultural. A society that had relied entirely on oral tradition was gradually becoming familiar with the written word. Laws that had been remembered through oral recitation began to be recorded on parchment. Land grants that had been witnessed by human memory started to be documented in written charters. The entire basis of social organization was slowly but fundamentally shifting. Simultaneously with these educational innovations, Felix was organizing the systematic evangelization of East Anglia's scattered population. Unlike earlier Christian missions that had focused primarily on converting kings and nobles, Felix's approach was comprehensive and methodical. Teams of priests, many of them trained in his own school, were sent to every village and hamlet in the kingdom. These missionary priests were carefully prepared for their work. They had been taught not just Christian doctrine, but also something of Anglo-Saxon custom and belief, enabling them to present Christianity in ways that would be comprehensible to pagan audiences. They understood that successful conversion required not just the replacement of old beliefs with new ones, but the careful integration of Christian teaching with the cultural patterns that gave meaning to Anglo-Saxon life. The results of this systematic approach were remarkable. Village after village experienced conversion, not through dramatic royal commands, but through patient teaching and persuasion. Old sacred groves were not destroyed, but rather consecrated to Christian use. Traditional seasonal festivals were gradually transformed into Christian celebrations that preserved their community-building functions while redirecting their religious significance. Archaeological evidence from this period shows the rapid proliferation of Christian symbols and practices throughout East Anglia. Pagan burial customs, which had emphasized the afterlife journey with elaborate grave goods, were replaced by simple Christian interments that reflected belief in bodily resurrection. Christian crosses began appearing on jewelry, pottery, and architectural elements. Church buildings, initially simple wooden structures, started appearing in communities throughout the kingdom. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of a distinctively East Anglian form of Christianity that reflected both Felix's continental sophistication and the kingdom's Anglo-Saxon heritage. This was not merely imported Roman Christianity, but something new, a synthesis that would serve as a model for Christian development throughout England. The success of Felix's mission created a momentum that attracted additional religious figures to East Anglia. Word of what was being accomplished in this corner of Anglo-Saxon England began to spread through the networks that connected Christian communities throughout Britain and continental Europe. It was through these networks that news of Sigeberht's Christian kingdom reached the distant shores of Ireland, where a remarkable holy man named Fursey was contemplating his own calling to missionary work among the Anglo-Saxons. Saint Fursey and the Irish connection Saint Fursey, or Fursa as he was known in his native Ireland, represented a very different strand of Christianity from the Roman tradition that Felix embodied. Born somewhere in the Western Territories of Ireland, possibly in the region of modern Connaught, around the year 597, Fursey had grown up immersed in the distinctive Celtic Christian tradition that had flourished in Ireland for nearly 2 centuries. Irish Christianity possessed a character quite unlike its continental counterpart. While Roman Christianity emphasized episcopal organization, urban churches, and close cooperation with secular rulers, Celtic Christianity was profoundly monastic, rural, and often maintained a certain independence from worldly power. Irish monks were famous throughout Christian Europe for their extreme asceticism, their love of learning, and their willingness to undertake the most difficult missionary journeys in what they called white martyrdom, the abandonment of homeland and kindred for the sake of spreading the gospel. Fursey embodied all these Celtic Christian virtues. From his youth, he had demonstrated an extraordinary spiritual sensitivity, experiencing visions and mystical states that marked him as someone specially touched by divine grace. These were not gentle, comforting visions, but often terrifying encounters with the realities of sin, judgment, and redemption that left permanent marks on his soul, and, according to later accounts, even on his physical body. His monastic training had taken place at Innisquin on Lough Corrib, under the guidance of St. Brendan and later St. Meldon. There he had mastered not just the basics of Christian theology, but also the sophisticated intellectual tradition that Irish monasteries had developed, which uniquely combined classical learning, biblical scholarship, and the mystical theology of the Desert Fathers. By his early 30s, Fursey had already established his own monastery at Rathmat, somewhere in what is now County Clare, which had become renowned throughout Ireland for its scholarly rigour and spiritual intensity. But despite his success, Fursey felt called to something more challenging, the conversion of the still largely pagan Anglo-Saxons who had conquered much of Britain. The journey that would bring Fursey to East Anglia around the year 633 was not direct. He travelled first through British territories in what is now Wales, where Celtic Christianity still maintained its hold against Anglo-Saxon paganism. These travels gave him valuable experience in cross-cultural missionary work and may have provided him with intelligence about where his efforts might be most fruitfully directed. When word reached Fursey of King Sigebert's Christian restoration in East Anglia and the remarkable work being accomplished by Bishop Felix, he would have recognized an exceptional opportunity. Here was an Anglo-Saxon kingdom, not merely tolerating Christianity, but actively promoting it, led by a king who valued learning and supported missionary work with royal resources. Fursey's arrival in East Anglia, probably in late 633 or early 634, brought with it not just another missionary, but an entire Irish missionary community. He was accompanied by his brothers Foilan and Ultan, both of whom were themselves experienced in monastic life, as well as a group of Irish priests and monks. Perhaps most significantly, they brought with them holy relics, the remains of Saints Meldon and Beowulf, that would serve as spiritual focal points for their missionary work. King Sigebert's reception of Fursey and his companions demonstrated the remarkable openness that characterized his reign. Despite the theological and organizational differences between Roman and Celtic Christianity, differences that would later cause significant tensions in Anglo-Saxon England, Sigebert recognized the value that Irish missionaries could bring to his kingdom's spiritual development. The king offered Fursey his choice of sites for establishing a monastery, and Fursey's selection revealed both his practical wisdom and his spiritual discernment. He chose Nobersburg, an abandoned Roman fort that would later be identified with Burgh Castle in what is now Norfolk. The location was ideal for multiple reasons. It was situated on high ground overlooking the confluence of rivers, providing both security and access to water transport. Its Roman walls, though partially ruined, still offered protection and a ready-made enclosure, and its position near the coast allowed for easy communication with Ireland and continental Europe. The monastery that Fursey established at Knobersburg represented a transplantation of Irish monastic culture into Anglo-Saxon England. Unlike Felix's more institutional approach, which emphasized organized parishes and episcopal administration, Fursey's monastery followed the Irish model of being a largely self-contained spiritual community that served as a base for missionary expeditions into the surrounding countryside. The daily life at Nobersburg would have followed patterns familiar from Irish monasteries. The hours of the day were structured around the 7 canonical hours of prayer, beginning with matins before dawn and concluding with compline after sunset. Between these services, the monks engaged in manual labor, tending the monastery's fields and animals, copying manuscripts, and crafting the tools and furnishings needed for daily life. But Fursey's monastery was distinguished by something beyond the typical monastic routine. The abbot himself was known for his extraordinary spiritual gifts, particularly his visionary experiences. According to accounts that circulated widely in his lifetime and after, Fursey would sometimes enter ecstatic states during which he experienced direct revelations about the spiritual realm. The most famous of these visions, which was later recorded in detail by the Venerable Bede, occurred during Fursey's time in East Anglia. In this vision, Fursey was taken up by angels and shown the cosmic battle between good and evil for human souls. He witnessed the 4 fires that would consume the world: falsehood, covetousness, discord, and injustice, and saw how demons used human sins as fuel for these fires. Most remarkably, when a demon threw a burning sinner at Fursey during this vision, the holy man was burned by the contact, and this spiritual burn manifested as a physical scar that remained on his body for the rest of his life. This fusion of spiritual experience and physical reality made a profound impression on those who heard of it, providing tangible evidence of the reality of the spiritual realm. These visions served multiple purposes in Fursey's missionary work. For recently converted Anglo-Saxons still uncertain about abandoning their ancestral gods, they provided dramatic evidence of Christianity's spiritual power. For those already Christian, they reinforced the importance of moral conduct and the reality of divine judgment. And for Fursey himself, they appeared to have been genuine mystical experiences that deepened his own spiritual life and strengthened his commitment to missionary work. The relationship between Felix and Fursey, representing, as they did, two quite different Christian traditions, could have been a source of conflict. Roman Christianity, with its emphasis on episcopal authority and organizational structure, had often clashed with Celtic Christianity's more individualistic and mystical approach. The dating of Easter, the style of monastic tonsure, and questions of ecclesiastical jurisdiction were already causing tensions in other parts of Britain. But in East Anglia, under Sigebert's wise governance, these differences were managed with remarkable success. Felix, with his continental sophistication, recognized the value that Fursey's charismatic spirituality brought to the missionary effort. Fursey, despite his independence of spirit, respected the episcopal authority that Felix represented, and Sigeberht himself seems to have actively worked to ensure that both traditions could flourish without coming into destructive conflict. The result was a uniquely rich Christian culture in East Anglia that drew on the best of both traditions. Felix's schools provided the educational foundation and organizational structure, while Fursey's monastery offered spiritual depth and mystical intensity. Roman Christianity contributed its genius for institution building and its connections to wider European civilization, while Celtic Christianity brought its passion for learning, its ascetic discipline, and its profound sense of God's immediate presence in the world. This synthesis was evident in the missionary work that radiated out from both Dommoc and Noburesburg. Priests trained in Felix's schools, but inspired by Fursey's example, travelled throughout East Anglia, preaching the gospel with both intellectual sophistication and spiritual fervour. Converts experienced Christianity not just as a set of doctrines to be learned, but as a living encounter with divine power. The impact on Anglo-Saxon culture was profound and multifaceted. The traditional Germanic warrior ethos, with its emphasis on loyalty, courage, and the pursuit of glory through battle, began to be transformed by Christian values of humility, forgiveness, and the pursuit of spiritual rather than worldly honor. The clan-based structure of Anglo-Saxon society started to be overlaid with a universal community of Christian believers that transcended tribal boundaries. Art and craftsmanship were particularly affected by this cultural transformation. Anglo-Saxon metalworkers, who had previously created primarily weapons and warrior regalia, began producing Christian liturgical objects, chalices, reliquaries, processional crosses, that combined traditional Anglo-Saxon artistic motifs with Christian symbolism. Manuscript illumination, previously unknown in England, began to flourish as monks trained in both Irish and continental techniques created beautiful copies of scripture and theological texts. The establishment of scriptoriums at both Dommoc and Knoburesburg meant that books, previously incredibly rare in Anglo-Saxon England, began to multiply. Bibles, psalters, lives of saints, theological commentaries, and even classical texts deemed useful for Christian education were being copied and studied. Each monastery's library grew, and with it, the intellectual sophistication of East Anglian Christianity. Perhaps most significantly, the presence of both Felix and Fursey in East Anglia created a model of Christian unity in diversity that would influence English Christianity for centuries to come. The Synod of Whitby in 664, which would later attempt to resolve the differences between Roman and Celtic Christianity throughout Britain, might have had a very different and more contentious outcome had not the earlier East Anglian experience demonstrated that these traditions could coexist fruitfully. King Sigeberht watched these developments with deep satisfaction. His vision of a Christian kingdom that valued learning and spiritual depth was being realized beyond his most optimistic expectations. The schools were producing literate Christians who could read scripture and participate more fully in religious life. The monasteries were becoming centers of both prayer and scholarship. The missionary work was reaching into every corner of his kingdom, transforming not just religious belief, but the entire cultural fabric of East Anglian society. Yet even as these triumphs unfolded, Sigeberht was experiencing a growing inner tension between his royal responsibilities and his own spiritual longings. The years of study in Gaul had awakened in him a profound attraction to the contemplative life. The daily demands of kingship, the political calculations, the military preparations, the endless administrative decisions, increasingly felt like distractions from what he had come to see as his true calling. Late at night, after the day's royal business was concluded, Sigeberht would often visit the monasteries that dotted his kingdom. There, in the peaceful rhythm of monastic life, surrounded by the smell of parchment and the soft murmur of prayers, he felt most fully himself. The scholar who had accidentally become a king was beginning to wonder whether he might yet become the monk he had always been meant to be. This internal struggle would soon lead to one of the most unusual decisions in Anglo-Saxon history, a decision that would demonstrate both Sigeberht's spiritual depth and the unique character of his reign. But before that momentous choice, the scholar king had one more great project to accomplish, one that would secure his legacy as the father of English education and ensure that the light of learning would continue to shine long after his own earthly journey had ended. The flowering of a Christian kingdom. The middle years of Sigeberht's reign, roughly from 633 to 634, represented the full flowering of his vision for a Christian East Anglia. The dual foundations laid by Bishop Felix and Abbot Fursey were bearing fruit beyond anyone's initial expectations, and the kingdom was experiencing a cultural and spiritual renaissance that would echo through the centuries. The transformation was perhaps most visible in the landscape itself, where once there had been only the occasional pagan shrine or sacred grove. Now church buildings were appearing with remarkable frequency. These structures varied greatly in size and sophistication, from simple wooden chapels in remote villages to more elaborate stone churches in larger settlements, but each proclaimed the same message. Christianity had come to stay in East Anglia. The construction of these churches followed patterns that reflected the fusion of traditions that characterized Sigeberht's reign. The basic architectural forms were Anglo-Saxon, rectangular halls with steep-pitched roofs, heavy timber construction, and an emphasis on functional simplicity. But Christian elements transformed these familiar forms into something new. The Eastern orientation of the altar, pointing toward Jerusalem, gave each building a cosmic connection to the wider Christian world. The careful placement of windows to allow morning light to illuminate the altar during services created a sense of divine presence that spoke powerfully to new converts. Inside these churches, the transformation of Anglo-Saxon artistic traditions was equally evident. The intricate interlace patterns that Anglo-Saxon craftsmen had traditionally used to decorate weapons and jewelry now adorned altar frontals and liturgical vessels. The animal motifs that had symbolized clan totems were reinterpreted as symbols of Christian virtues: the lion for Christ's kingship, the lamb for his sacrifice, the dove for the Holy Spirit. Wall paintings inspired by continental examples but executed by local artists began to appear in the more prosperous churches. These were not merely decorative, but served a crucial educational function in a society where literacy was still limited. Biblical scenes, the Nativity, the Crucifixion, the Resurrection, told the Christian story in visual form that could be understood by those who could not yet read. The monasteries that were being founded under royal patronage during these years became not just centres of prayer, but also economic powerhouses that helped transform East Anglia's prosperity. Monks, bringing agricultural techniques learned in Gaul and Ireland, introduced new crops and improved farming methods. The systematic record-keeping that was natural to monastic life led to more efficient management of estates. The monastery's connections to continental trading networks brought new goods and new markets to East Anglia. Soham Abbey, traditionally attributed to Felix's foundation, became a particularly important centre. Located in the Fens, that vast wetland region that separated East Anglia from the kingdoms to the west, Soham was ideally positioned to serve as both a spiritual centre and a practical hub for the region's development. The monks' knowledge of hydraulic engineering, brought from continental monasteries that had wrestled with similar water management challenges, began the long process of fen drainage and reclamation that would eventually transform thousands of acres of marshland into productive farmland. The scriptorium at Soham became renowned for the quality of its manuscript production. Here, monks trained in both Irish and continental bookmaking traditions created works that combined the technical precision of Roman scripts with the elaborate decoration characteristic of Celtic manuscripts. The books that emerged from Soham, Gospels, Psalters, Lives of Saints, were not just functional texts, but works of art that proclaimed the glory of God through their beauty. King Sigebert's personal involvement in these developments was extraordinary for an Anglo-Saxon ruler. Unlike most kings, whose primary concerns were military leadership and the distribution of treasure to loyal followers, Sigebert devoted considerable time and attention to educational and religious matters. He regularly visited the schools, observing teaching methods, and sometimes even participating in discussions with students and teachers. He attended the copying of important manuscripts in monastic scriptoriums, understanding that books were treasures more valuable than gold or jewels. The king's court itself became a centre of learning unprecedented in Anglo-Saxon England, where previous royal halls had resounded primarily with the songs of warriors and the boasts of battle-hardened thegns. Sigebert's court welcomed scholars, theologians, and poets. Latin conversation, previously almost unknown in Anglo-Saxon royal circles, became common among the king's closest advisors. Theological debates, conducted with the sophistication one might expect in a continental episcopal palace, took place in the very halls where previous generations had planned military campaigns. This intellectual atmosphere attracted talented individuals from throughout Britain and beyond. Scholars from Kent, where Christianity was more established, came to participate in Sigebert's educational experiment. Irish monks, hearing of the welcome that Fursey had received, arrived to contribute their own learning and spiritual intensity. Even a few continental scholars, intrigued by reports of an Anglo-Saxon king who valued learning above warfare, made the journey to East Anglia to see for themselves this remarkable phenomenon. The curriculum that was developing in Sigebert's schools was becoming increasingly sophisticated. The foundation remained Latin literacy and basic Christian doctrine, but more advanced students could now study a range of subjects that would have been familiar in the best continental schools: grammar, rhetoric, and logic. The classical trivium provided the intellectual framework for more specialized studies in theology, biblical exegesis, and church history. Particularly innovative was the attention given to what we might call practical literacy, the ability to write legal documents, maintain administrative records, and conduct diplomatic correspondence. Sigeberht understood that the long-term success of his Christian kingdom required not just devout believers, but also competent administrators who could manage the increasingly complex business of governance in a literate society. The impact of these educational efforts was beginning to be felt throughout East Anglia. Young men trained in Sigeberht's schools were returning to their home communities as teachers, scribes, and local administrators. Village reeves, who had previously relied entirely on memory and oral tradition, were now maintaining written records of taxes, land holdings, and legal judgments. The entire administrative infrastructure of the kingdom was gradually being transformed by the spread of literacy. Women, too, were beginning to benefit from these educational developments, though in more limited ways. While formal schooling remained primarily a male preserve, noblewomen and even some commoners were learning to read, usually through private instruction from priests or monks. This had important implications for religious life, as women who could read had direct access to scripture and devotional texts, rather than depending entirely on priestly mediation. The transformation of East Anglian Christianity was not limited to institutional developments. At the personal level, individual faith was deepening and becoming more sophisticated. Converts were moving beyond mere acceptance of Christian teachings to genuine spiritual formation. The sacramental life of the Church, baptism, Eucharist, confession, marriage, anointing, was creating new rhythms and patterns that structured both individual lives and community experience. Particularly significant was the development of a Christian calendar that overlay and gradually displaced the traditional pagan seasonal festivals. Christmas replaced the midwinter celebrations that had marked the darkest time of the year. Easter, with its movable date determined by complex calculations, replaced the spring fertility festivals. Saints' days provided new occasions for community gathering and celebration, maintaining the social functions of pagan festivals while directing religious devotion toward Christian ends. The liturgical year that was taking shape in East Anglia reflected the same fusion of traditions that characterized other aspects of Sigeberht's reign. Roman practices, brought by Felix, provided the basic framework. The great feasts of Christmas, Easter, and Pentecost, the fasts of Advent and Lent, the cycle of readings that moved through the biblical narrative over the course of the year. But Celtic influences, brought by Fursey, added distinctive elements. Particular saints' days favoured in Irish tradition certain prayers and hymns unique to Celtic Christianity, and a mystical intensity that gave even routine services a sense of encountering divine mystery. The preaching that characterized this period reflected the intellectual and spiritual sophistication that East Anglian Christianity was achieving. Felix's priests, trained in continental methods, delivered carefully constructed homilies that explained Christian doctrine with theological precision. Fursey's monks, drawing on Irish tradition, offered more mystical and visionary preaching that emphasized personal spiritual experience and the reality of the unseen world. Together, these approaches provided a rich and balanced spiritual diet for East Anglian Christians. The moral transformation that accompanied religious conversion was perhaps the most profound change of all. The traditional Anglo-Saxon value system, with its emphasis on loyalty to clan, the duty of blood vengeance, and the pursuit of glory through warfare, was being challenged by Christian ethics of forgiveness, universal love, and the pursuit of eternal rather than temporal rewards. This moral revolution created real tensions in Anglo-Saxon society. How could a warrior culture embrace forgiveness when honor demanded vengeance for insults and injuries? How could rulers maintain order without the threat of violent retribution? How could young men achieve status and respect, if not through martial prowess? These questions had no easy answers, and the process of Christian moral formation involved considerable struggle. and compromise. Sigeberht himself grappled with these tensions in ways that would have been visible to his subjects. The king, who had been trained as a warrior, who bore noble blood that demanded he lead his people in battle, was increasingly drawn to Christian ideals of peace and reconciliation. His reluctance to engage in unnecessary warfare, his preference for diplomatic solutions over military ones, his emphasis on justice rather than naked power, all these reflected the deep internalization of Christian values. The legal system of East Anglia was beginning to reflect these Christian influences as well. Traditional Anglo-Saxon law had been largely concerned with maintaining social order through carefully calibrated systems of compensation and revenge. An injury to one person triggered obligations for their entire kindred to seek either compensation or vengeance. This system, while effective in its own context, could generate endless cycles of violence and social disruption. Christian influence was gradually introducing new concepts: the idea of individual rather than collective responsibility, the possibility of forgiveness as an alternative to vengeance, the notion that some offences were sins against God rather than merely crimes against individuals or clans. Written law codes, maintained by literate Christian administrators, were beginning to replace purely customary law, creating more consistent and predictable legal procedures. The economic life of East Anglia was also being transformed by Christian influence. Monasteries, as we have noted, were introducing new agricultural techniques and serving as hubs for trade networks. But beyond these practical impacts, Christian teaching about charity, the proper use of wealth, and obligations to the poor was beginning to affect how resources were distributed and utilized. The concept of almsgiving, previously unknown in pagan Anglo-Saxon culture, was becoming established. Wealthy individuals, including the king himself, were expected to support the poor, widows, orphans, and other vulnerable members of society. This was not merely optional generosity, but a religious obligation, enforced by spiritual sanctions and social pressure. Churches and monasteries were establishing charitable institutions, hospices for travellers, hospitals for the sick, almshouses for the destitute, that provided a social safety net previously absent from Anglo-Saxon society. The care of lepers, in particular, became a Christian specialty, as these most rejected members of society found in the church communities willing to minister to their needs, despite the risk of contagion. The diplomatic relationships that Sigeberht had carefully cultivated with neighbouring kingdoms were bearing fruit in these middle years of his reign. East Anglia's renewed prosperity and its reputation as a centre of Christian learning made it an attractive ally. Trade relationships with Kent provided access to continental goods and markets. Alliance with Northumbria, where Christian King Oswald was consolidating his rule, offered security against potential threats from pagan Mercia. These diplomatic successes were not merely the result of shrewd political calculation, but reflected the wider respect that Sigeberht's unique approach to kingship was generating. Other Christian rulers recognized in him not just a useful ally, but a kindred spirit whose values and vision aligned with their own. The scholar king was becoming a model of Christian rulership that would influence how Anglo-Saxon kings understood their role for generations to come. Yet even as these triumphs multiplied, even as the kingdom flourished under his wise guidance, Sigeberht was experiencing a growing inner restlessness. The contemplative life that he had tasted during his years in Gaul, and that he glimpsed in his visits to the monasteries of his kingdom, called to him with increasing urgency. The demanding business of kingship, which he had undertaken from duty and necessity, felt increasingly like an obstacle to his true spiritual calling. Late into the nights, after the day's endless meetings and decisions, Sigeberht would sit alone in his royal hall, wrestling with a question that few kings had ever seriously entertained. could he abandon his throne, not for another worldly ambition, but for the sake of his soul? The call of the cloister, the inner struggle that had been building within King Sigeberht throughout his successful reign, came to a head sometime in late 633 or early 634. The king who had accomplished so much, who had transformed East Anglia from a pagan backwater into a thriving Christian kingdom, who had established schools and monasteries, who had brought together Roman and Celtic Christianity in fruitful cooperation, was about to make a decision that would shock the Anglo-Saxon world. The signs of Sigebert's growing spiritual restlessness would have been visible to those close to him. His visits to monasteries became more frequent and prolonged. He spent increasing time in prayer and meditation, sometimes withdrawing from court activities for days at a stretch. His conversations turned more and more toward theological and spiritual matters, less and less toward the practical concerns of governance. Those advisers who knew him best must have recognized what was coming, though they could scarcely believe that he would actually follow through with such an unprecedented course of action. Anglo-Saxon kings might retire due to age, infirmity, or defeat in battle, but for a king in his prime to voluntarily abandon his throne for religious reasons was simply unheard of. The monastery that increasingly drew Sigebert's attention was the one he had himself founded at Beodrisesworth, a site that would later become famous as Bury St Edmunds. Located in a strong defensive position on the upper reaches of the River Lark, Beodrisesworth was perfectly situated to serve as both a spiritual retreat and a centre of learning. The monastery occupied what had likely been the estate of a nobleman named Beodric, whose name was preserved in the place's designation, Beodric's Worth, or curtilage. The choice of this particular monastery for Sigebert's contemplation was significant in multiple ways. Unlike Nobersburg, which was clearly Irish in character under Fursey's leadership, or the establishments more directly connected to Felix's continental influence, Beodrisesworth represented something uniquely East Anglian, a synthesis of traditions that reflected Sigebert's own vision of Christianity. The monastery's location also provided access to the network of rivers and roads that connected East Anglia's scattered communities. From Beodrisesworth, one could reach the great fen country to the west, where Soham Abbey was transforming marshland into productive farmland. The ancient Roman road still provided routes to the royal centres at Rendlesham and the burial grounds at Sutton Hoo. It was a place of contemplation that remained connected to the wider world, much like Sigebert himself. During his increasingly frequent visits to Beodrisesworth, Sigebert would participate fully in the monastic routine, the 7 daily offices of prayer, the manual labour in fields and workshop, the silent meals, the hours of study and meditation. For a man whose days as king were filled with the constant demands of others, the structured simplicity of monastic life must have seemed like a liberation. In the monastery's scriptorium, Sigebert could indulge his love of learning without the interruption of petitioners and ambassadors. He could spend entire afternoons poring over manuscripts, discussing theological points with learned monks, or simply sitting in silent contemplation. The scholar who had become a king was rediscovering the joy of being simply a student of divine wisdom. But Sigebert's contemplation of monastic life was not merely an escape from the burdens of kingship. It reflected a deeply thought-out theological understanding of what was ultimately valuable in human existence. The Christian teachings he had absorbed during his years in Gaul had convinced him that earthly power and glory were ultimately transient, while the soul's relationship with God was eternal. This conviction was reinforced by his observation of the remarkable spiritual fruits that monastic life was producing in East Anglia. The monasteries he had helped establish were not just centres of prayer, but also powerhouses of spiritual formation that were transforming individual lives, and through them, society as a whole. Monks who had renounced worldly ambition were accomplishing far more lasting good than many who sought power and wealth. The specific spiritual crisis that finally precipitated Sigebert's decision is not recorded in the surviving sources, but we can imagine its contours. Perhaps it was a particularly profound religious experience during one of his monastic visits, a moment of mystical insight that revealed to him with absolute clarity where his true calling lay. Or perhaps it was a gradual accumulation of small moments, the peace he felt during monastic offices, the joy of scholarly discussion uninterrupted by royal duties, the sense that he was finally living authentically when he was in the monastery, rather than the palace. Whatever the immediate trigger, by early 634, Sigeberht had reached his decision. He would abdicate the throne of East Anglia and enter Beodrisesworth as a simple monk. The scholar king would become Brother Sigeberht, exchanging royal robes for monastic habit, a crown for a tonsure, and earthly power for what he believed to be a more authentic form of spiritual authority. The practical arrangements for this unprecedented transition required careful planning. East Anglia could not simply be left without a ruler, and Sigeberht was too responsible to his people to create a succession crisis through impulsive action. The solution he chose demonstrated both his political wisdom and his continued concern for the kingdom's welfare, even as he prepared to leave it. Egric, who had ruled jointly with Sigeberht since the Restoration in 631, would assume sole kingship of East Anglia. This arrangement had several advantages. Egric was already familiar with royal authority and had demonstrated his capability in the military and administrative matters that had been primarily his responsibility during the joint reign. His probable pagan background meant he could maintain good relationships with those nobles who had never fully embraced Christianity, and his kinship with the Wulfinger dynasty ensured legitimacy in the eyes of traditional East Anglian society. The announcement of Sigebert's decision must have caused shock and consternation throughout the kingdom. Nobles who had fought to restore the rightful heir to the throne now watched in disbelief as he prepared to abandon it. Christian converts, who had seen in Sigeberht a model of Christian kingship, struggled to understand how their royal patron could leave them. Even pagan traditionalists, who had respected Sigebert's learning and diplomatic skill, even while disagreeing with his religious policies, wondered what this portended for the kingdom's future. Bishop Felix and Abbot Fursey, the two religious leaders who had worked most closely with Sigeberht, would have had complex reactions to his decision. On one hand, they could hardly condemn a choice to pursue monastic life, which both of them had themselves embraced. On the other hand, they must have worried about the implications for the Christian establishment in East Anglia. Sigeberht had been not just a supporter, but an active participant in the Christianization of his kingdom. Could the work continue as successfully under a king who lacked Sigebert's personal commitment and understanding? The farewell ceremonies, though not described in detail by surviving sources, must have been emotionally charged occasions. The king who was giving up his kingdom would have addressed his nobles one final time, explaining his decision in terms they could understand. Even if they could not fully accept it, he would have entrusted the kingdom's welfare to Egric, extracting promises of continued support for the Christian establishments that had been built during his reign. Then came the symbolic acts that marked the transition from one state of life to another. Sigeberht would have formally transferred the symbols of royal authority to Egric: the crown, the scepter, the royal sword. These objects, which in Anglo-Saxon culture carried profound symbolic meaning, represented not just personal power, but the welfare and identity of the entire people. Their transfer marked a decisive break with Sigebert's royal past. The journey from the royal hall to Beodrisesworth Monastery, though perhaps not physically lengthy, represented one of the most dramatic personal transformations in Anglo-Saxon history. With each step, Sigeberht was leaving behind not just power and luxury, but also the entire identity that had been constructed for him by birth and circumstances. The prince who had been exiled, educated and restored to kingship was now choosing a final exile, not from his kingdom, but from worldly ambition itself. At the monastery gates, Sigeberht would have performed the formal rituals of monastic entrance. He would have removed his royal garments, symbolic of the world he was leaving behind, and donned the simple habit of a monk. His hair would have been cut in the distinctive monastic tonsure, not the Celtic style that shaved the front of the head, nor the Roman style that created a crown of hair, but whichever tradition Beodrisesworth followed. Most significantly, Sigeberht would have made formal vows of stability, obedience and conversion of life. These were not casual promises but solemn oaths that bound him as surely as any royal oath had ever done. He was vowing to remain in this monastery, to obey its abbot as he had once commanded others to obey him, and to pursue the transformation of his soul with the same dedication he had once devoted to the transformation of his kingdom. The abbot who received these vows must have felt the weight of the moment. Here was a king, a man who had commanded armies and directed the affairs of an entire kingdom, now placing himself under monastic authority. The spiritual drama of this reversal, the powerful becoming powerless, the ruler becoming ruled, the commander becoming obedient, embodied the radical nature of Christian commitment in its purest form. For Sigeberht himself, the relief must have been profound. After years of wrestling with the tension between his royal duties and his spiritual calling, he had finally chosen. The constant demands of kingship, the political calculations, the military concerns, the endless petitions and judgments, all these were now behind him. Ahead lay the structured peace of monastic life, the opportunity to pursue learning without distraction, and the chance to focus entirely on the cultivation of his relationship with God. The scholar monk's peaceful years, the months that followed Sigeberht's entry into Beodrisesworth Monastery, marked a period of profound personal transformation and surprising contentment for the former king. Brother Sigeberht, as he now insisted on being called, embraced his new life with the same thoroughness that had characterized his kingship. The daily rhythm of monastic life would have provided a comforting structure after the unpredictable demands of royal administration. The monastic horarium, or schedule, divided the day into alternating periods of prayer, work and study. This threefold pattern, ora, labora, et leg, pray, work and read, gave shape and meaning to every hour. The day began in the deepest part of the night with matins, the first of the 7 canonical hours. In the darkness before dawn, monks would gather in the church, their voices joining in the ancient psalms and prayers that had been offered by monastics for centuries. For Sigeberht, these pre-dawn prayers must have been particularly meaningful, a time when the world slept, but the monasteries kept vigil, maintaining humanity's conversation with the divine. As dawn broke, lauds would follow, welcoming the new day with prayers of praise. Then came prime, marking the first working hour, followed by terce at mid-morning. Each of these services consisted of psalms, readings from scripture, and prayers that connected the monks to the wider Christian world and to the communion of saints throughout history. Between the offices of prayer, Sigeberht would have participated in the manual labour that was an essential part of Benedictine monasticism. This was not merely practical work to maintain the monastery, but a spiritual discipline in itself. The former king might be found working in the monastery's fields, tending vegetables in the kitchen garden, or helping to maintain the buildings and grounds. This physical labour served multiple purposes. It provided for the monastery's material needs, reducing dependence on outside support. It kept the body healthy and prevented the stagnation that could come from excessive study. But most importantly, It was a form of humility training, a constant reminder that all honest work had dignity, and that the cultivation of the soul required the discipline of the body. The monastery's scriptorium became Sigebert's particular haven. Here, surrounded by the tools of literacy that he had worked so hard to bring to his kingdom, he could indulge his love of learning without guilt or distraction. The former king proved to be a skilled copyist, his years of education in Gaul having given him a beautiful hand for both Latin and the insular script that was developing in British monasteries. Sigebert's scholarly work during his monastic years appears to have focused particularly on biblical studies. He participated in the careful copying of scripture that was one of monasticism's most important functions. Each letter was formed with care, each word checked against exemplars to ensure accuracy. This painstaking work was itself a form of prayer, a meditation on the Word of God that engaged mind, hand, and heart. But Sigebert's contribution went beyond mere copying. His years of education and his naturally acute mind made him valuable as a textual scholar. When questions arose about difficult passages, when variant readings in different manuscripts needed to be reconciled, when theological interpretation was required, in these matters, Brother Sigebert's learning proved invaluable. The former king also became a teacher within the monastery, instructing younger monks in Latin grammar, biblical interpretation, and theological basics. This role must have been deeply satisfying for someone who had invested so much in education during his reign. Now, instead of establishing schools for his kingdom, he was directly forming the minds and souls of individual students. Visitors to Biodrzycieworth during these years reported being struck by Sigebert's evident contentment. The man who had once carried the weight of an entire kingdom on his shoulders seemed lighter, freer, more genuinely at peace than he had ever been as king. When asked about his remarkable decision to abandon royal power, he would speak not of sacrifice, but of liberation, the joy of finally living in accordance with his deepest calling. The theological reading that occupied much of Sigebert's study time reveals the sophistication of his spiritual life. He was particularly drawn to the works of Augustine of Hippo, especially the Confessions, with its profound exploration of the journey from worldly ambition to spiritual fulfillment. The parallel between Augustine's abandoned career as a rhetorician and Sigebert's abandoned throne would not have been lost on him. He also studied Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, that foundational text on Christian leadership. The irony must have been evident. Here was a former king reading about how to properly exercise spiritual authority, finding in these pages wisdom that he now applied not to governing a kingdom, but to governing his own soul. The writings of the Desert Fathers particularly appealed to Sigebert's contemplative temperament. These accounts of Egyptian and Syrian monks who had fled to the wilderness to pursue God with single-minded devotion resonated with his own journey from worldly power to monastic simplicity. Their sayings, pithy expressions of hard-won spiritual wisdom, became part of his daily meditation. Celtic spiritual writings, brought to East Anglia by Fursey and his Irish companions, added another dimension to Sigebert's reading. The Irish tradition's emphasis on creation spirituality, on finding God in the natural world, gave him new ways of experiencing the divine presence. The elaborate Celtic prayers, with their invocation of angels, saints, and the elements of creation, enriched his devotional life. Despite his contentment, Sigebert remained aware of the kingdom he had left behind. News from the outside world reached the monastery regularly. Reports of Eckric's governance, updates on the Christian establishments Sigebert had founded, intelligence about threats from neighboring kingdoms. The former king would listen to these reports with interest, sometimes offering quiet advice to messengers who sought his counsel, but always maintaining the monastic detachment that he had vowed. Of particular concern was the growing threat from Mercia under its formidable pagan king, Penda. This warrior king had already demonstrated his military prowess and his hostility to Christian kingdoms. Sigeberht would have recognized that the diplomatic and military structures he had built might not withstand a determined Mercian assault, especially under a king like Ecgric, who lacked his predecessor's political sophistication. The monastery itself was flourishing under Sigebert's influence. His presence attracted both students and patrons. Nobles who wanted their sons educated in a place blessed by a royal saint increasingly sent them to Beodrishes. Wealthy benefactors, inspired by the former king's example of renunciation, made generous donations to support the monastic community. The library at Beodrishes grew as manuscripts were acquired from other monasteries or copied in its own scriptorium. Books that Sigeberht had known in Gaul began to appear: theological treatises, biblical commentaries, lives of saints, even some classical texts deemed useful for Christian education. The monastery was becoming a significant centre of learning in its own right. Spiritually, Sigeberht appears to have experienced during these monastic years a deepening of the contemplative prayer that had attracted him to monasticism in the first place. He moved beyond mere formal prayer into what the mystical tradition called contemplatio, wordless communion with God that transcended even the beauty of liturgical prayer. These experiences of divine presence would have come during the long hours of Lectio Divina, the meditative reading of Scripture that was central to Benedictine spirituality. A passage of Scripture would be read slowly, repeatedly, until it became not just understood intellectually, but absorbed spiritually. The words would sink deep into the soul, becoming a living reality rather than merely a text to be studied. The changing seasons marked the passage of time in the monastery, with a rhythm that was at once natural and liturgical. Spring brought the celebration of Easter with its dramatic movement from the sorrow of Good Friday to the joy of Resurrection Sunday. Summer saw the long growing season when the monastery's fields yielded their harvest. Autumn brought the feasts of various saints, each celebrated with special vigour. Winter brought the penitential season of Advent and the light-filled joy of Christmas. Through all these seasons, Sigeberht maintained the discipline of monastic life with remarkable consistency. He was noted for his punctuality at the offices, his cheerful acceptance of assigned tasks, his willingness to take on the most humble duties. The king who had once commanded others was now an example of holy obedience. Yet beneath this surface peace, a storm was gathering that would test Sigeberht's commitment to his new life in the most dramatic way imaginable. In the world beyond the monastery walls, political and military forces were moving that would soon force the reluctant monk to confront once again the responsibilities of kingship, with tragic consequences that would transform him from Brother Sigeberht into Saint Sigeberht, martyr. The growing storm. While Sigeberht cultivated his soul in the peaceful confines of Beodrishes, the political and military situation in Anglo-Saxon England was deteriorating with alarming speed. The comfortable balance of power that had characterized the early 630s was giving way to a period of unprecedented instability and violence that would ultimately draw even a reluctant monk back into the world of warfare and statecraft. At the center of this growing crisis was Penda of Mercia, whose ambitions and military capabilities were proving to be among the most formidable forces in 7th century Britain. Penda was not merely a pagan king in a world increasingly dominated by Christianity. He was a brilliant strategist, a charismatic leader, and a man who understood how to exploit the weaknesses and divisions of his rivals. Penda's rise to power had been remarkable. The kingdom of Mercia, occupying the English Midlands, had previously been overshadowed by more established powers like Northumbria and East Anglia. But under Penda's aggressive leadership, Mercia was rapidly becoming the dominant force in central England. His military victories were not random acts of violence but calculated campaigns designed to expand Mercian power and influence. What made Penda particularly dangerous was his ability to forge alliances that crossed both religious and ethnic boundaries. Though himself a committed pagan, he had no qualms about allying with Christian rulers when it served Mercian interests. He had worked closely with Cadwallon of Gwynedd, a Christian British king, in the campaign that had killed Edwin of Northumbria in 633. This pragmatic approach to alliance building made Penda's intentions difficult to predict and his movements hard to counter. By the mid-630s, Penda had already claimed an impressive list of victories. He had participated in the defeat of Edwin at the Battle of Hatfield Chase, effectively destroying Northumbrian hegemony over the southern kingdoms. He had successfully raided into the territories of neighbouring kingdoms, demonstrating Mercian military reach. Most ominously for East Anglia, he had begun to show particular interest in the wealthy kingdom that bordered Mercia to the east. East Anglia, under King Ecgric, was far less prepared to meet this threat than it had been during Sigebert's active reign. Ecgric was by all accounts a capable enough military leader. He had, after all, been responsible for military affairs during the period of joint rule. But he lacked Sigebert's diplomatic sophistication and his ability to build the kind of alliances that could deter aggression or provide support when war came. More fundamentally, Ecgric lacked the moral authority that Sigebert had possessed. The scholar king had commanded respect not just through his royal blood, but through his evident wisdom, his learning, and his commitment to the welfare of his people. Ecgric, probably remaining pagan throughout his reign, could not claim the same kind of religious legitimacy that had been so important in binding together East Anglia's increasingly Christian population. The Christian establishments that Sigebert had worked so hard to build were also feeling the effects of his absence. While they continued to function and even to grow, they lacked the royal patron, who had not just supported them financially, but had understood their mission and actively participated in their work. Bishop Felix and Abbot Fursey did their best to maintain the momentum of Christian development, but they must have felt the absence of the king, who had been as much colleague as patron. Intelligence reports reaching Beodrisesworth painted an increasingly worrying picture. Penda was consolidating his control over the Middle Angles, the territory that lay between Mercia and East Anglia. This was a clear preparation for further expansion, and East Anglia was the obvious next target. Its wealth, accumulated during the prosperous reigns of Redwald and Sigebert, would provide resources for further Mercian expansion. Its conquest would give Penda control of the lucrative trade routes that connected the English kingdoms with continental Europe. Perhaps even more attractive to Penda was the symbolic value of conquering East Anglia. This had been one of the most powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, home to the Wulfingas dynasty that had once claimed overlordship over much of southern England. Its systematic Christianization under Sigebert had made it a showcase of what Christian kingship could accomplish. For Penda, the committed pagan, the defeat of such a kingdom would be both a political and a religious triumph. The East Anglian military situation was becoming critical. The kingdom had never maintained the kind of large-standing army that would be necessary to resist a full Mercian invasion. Like other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, East Anglia relied primarily on the fyrd, the militia of free men, who could be called up in times of danger, but who normally pursued their agricultural or commercial occupations. This system had worked well enough when warfare consisted primarily of border raids and brief campaigns. But Penda was pioneering a new kind of warfare. Longer campaigns, larger armies, more sophisticated strategies. The traditional Anglo-Saxon military system was poorly adapted to meet this challenge. Moreover, the morale of the East Anglian military was questionable. Warriors who had known and respected Sigeberht, who had seen him as a leader worth fighting for despite his scholarly inclinations, now served under a king who lacked that same combination of wisdom and charisma. The Christian warriors, in particular, must have wondered whether a pagan king could adequately defend a kingdom that had become so thoroughly identified with the Christian faith. The nobles who advised King Ecgric were becoming increasingly alarmed. In council meetings, they debated possible responses to the Mercian threat. Should they seek alliance with Northumbria, which also faced the Mercian danger? Should they attempt to negotiate with Penda, perhaps offering tribute in exchange for peace? Should they prepare for all-out war, mobilizing every available resource for what might be the kingdom's last stand? But beneath these strategic discussions ran a deeper current of desperation. Many nobles, particularly those who remembered Sigeberht's reign with nostalgia, believed that only the former king's return could save East Anglia. Sigeberht's reputation as a wise leader, his diplomatic connections, his moral authority, all these were desperately needed. More practically, Sigeberht's very presence might rally the kingdom's warriors in a way that Ecgric alone could not. The idea of asking Sigeberht to leave his monastery and resume royal responsibilities would have been discussed first in whispers, then in more open conversation. It was a desperate suggestion, almost blasphemous in its implication that monastic vows could be set aside for political necessity. But as the military situation deteriorated, even this extreme measure began to seem not just possible, but necessary. Bishop Felix and the other Christian leaders faced a terrible dilemma. They understood the gravity of the Mercian threat and recognized that Sigeberht's return might indeed be militarily advantageous, but they also honored monastic vows and understood the spiritual violence that would be done to Sigeberht if he were forced back into worldly affairs. How could they balance the needs of the kingdom's body with the needs of individual souls? Messages began to reach Beardrisesworth Monastery, at first indirectly through visitors, then more directly through formal embassies. The content was always similar. The kingdom was in danger. Ecgric needed help. The people needed the leadership that only Sigeberht could provide. Some messages appealed to duty. He was still a member of the royal family with obligations to the Wulfinger dynasty. Others appealed to compassion. Innocent people would suffer if East Anglia fell to Penda's forces. Sigeberht's response to these appeals was consistent and, from his perspective, entirely reasonable. He had abdicated the throne precisely to escape these earthly concerns. He had made solemn vows of stability and obedience that bound him to monastic life. To return to worldly affairs would be to break those vows and to abandon the spiritual calling that he believed God had placed upon him. The kingdom would have to find another solution. Brother Sigeberht could not and would not become King Sigeberht again, but events were moving toward a crisis that would not accept Sigeberht's refusal. Penda was completing his preparations for an invasion of East Anglia. His scouts had mapped the kingdom's defences, his spies had assessed its military capabilities, and his strategic planning had identified the most vulnerable points. The storm that had been building was about to break with devastating force over the peaceful fields and villages of East Anglia. In his monastery cell, Sigeberht must have sensed the approach of this crisis. Perhaps in prayer, he experienced premonitions of what was to come. Perhaps in quiet conversations with visitors, he heard the desperation in their voices and understood that his peaceful monastic existence was about to be violently interrupted. The scholar monk, who had thought he had left the world of warfare and politics behind, was about to face the greatest and most painful test of his commitment to the spiritual life he had chosen. Penda's invasion, the Mercian army that crossed into East Anglian territory sometime in the late 630s, the exact year remains uncertain, with historians suggesting dates ranging from 636 to 641, was unlike anything the kingdom had faced in living memory. Penda had assembled not merely a raiding party, but a force capable of conquering and occupying territory, a military machine that represented the cutting edge of Anglo-Saxon warfare. The size of Penda's army would have been substantial by the standards of the time. Anglo-Saxon armies rarely exceeded a few thousand warriors, but every indication suggests that Penda had mobilized a significant portion of Mercian military strength for this campaign. Warriors from the Mercian heartland were supplemented by contingents from subject peoples and allies, creating a diverse but formidable fighting force. The composition of this army reflected Penda's sophisticated approach to warfare. The core consisted of his personal war band, professional warriors who had fought with him in previous campaigns and who formed a disciplined, experienced nucleus. Around this core were arrayed the forces of Mercian nobles, each bringing their own retainers and third levies. Some British allies may have contributed troops as well, continuing the alliance pattern that had proven so successful in previous campaigns. The Mercian invasion route was carefully chosen to maximize strategic advantage. Rather than attacking directly toward the major population centers, Penda's forces appeared to have moved to cut off East Anglia from potential allies, particularly Northumbria. This strategy reflected Penda's understanding that defeating East Anglia's army was not enough. He needed to prevent reinforcements from arriving and to isolate his target completely. The first reports of the invasion would have reached King Ecgric at Rendlesham, or wherever the royal court was currently located. Messengers, exhausted from hard riding, would have brought news of Mercian forces crossing the border, of villages abandoned in panic, of advanced scouts probing East Anglian defences. The crisis that had been building for months had finally arrived. Ecgric's response demonstrated both his capabilities and his limitations as a military leader. He moved quickly to mobilize the East Anglian fyrd, sending out summons to every village and estate in the kingdom. Warriors began assembling at designated gathering points, bringing whatever weapons and armor they possessed. The core of professional warriors who served the king and major nobles provided an experienced element, but much of the army consisted of farmers and craftsmen, whose primary identity was not as soldiers. The size of the East Anglian force that Ecgric was able to assemble was significant. Bede describes it as not negligible, even while acknowledging that it was smaller than the Mercian army. This suggests several thousand warriors drawn from across the kingdom, representing both Christians and pagans, both those who had prospered under Sigeberht's reforms and those who had remained loyal to older traditions. But as this army gathered, a fundamental problem became apparent to Ecgric and his advisors. The warriors' morale was questionable. Many of them remembered Sigeberht's reign with nostalgia, seeing it as a time of prosperity and wise leadership. Ecgric, despite his capabilities, had never commanded the same level of respect and loyalty. The Christian warriors in particular seemed reluctant to risk their lives under a pagan king, defending a kingdom that had become so thoroughly identified with Christianity. The nobles who advised Ecgric began to press him with increasing urgency. The kingdom's survival might depend not just on military tactics, but on inspiration and leadership that could rally the warriors to fight with the desperate courage that would be needed. And there was only one man in East Anglia who possessed that kind of moral authority, the former king who now lived as a monk at Beodrisesworth. The decision to appeal to Sigeberht must have been difficult for Ecgric. On one level, it represented an admission that his own authority was insufficient, but on another level, it reflected pragmatic recognition of reality. If Sigeberht's presence could improve the army's morale and combat effectiveness, then requesting his help was not weakness, but wisdom. A formal delegation was dispatched to Beodrisesworth with a clear mission: convince Sigeberht to leave his monastery and accompany the army, if not as a commander, then at least as an inspiring presence. The delegation probably included both nobles, who had known Sigeberht during his reign, and Christian leaders who might have moral influence over the former king. The conversation that took place when this delegation reached Beodrisesworth represents one of the most dramatic moments in Anglo-Saxon history, even though its details were not recorded. We can imagine the scene, the delegation arriving at the monastery gates, being received in the guest hall, and then being brought before Sigeberht, probably in his simple monk's habit, perhaps engaged in some humble task, or emerging from the monastery church after prayer. The nobles would have presented their case with passion and urgency. The kingdom faced destruction. The Mercian army was larger and better prepared. The East Anglian warriors needed inspiration that only Sigeberht could provide. His presence would remind them of what they were fighting for, not just physical survival, but the preservation of the Christian civilization that had been built during his reign. They might have appealed to various motives: duty to family and dynasty. The Wulfinga's kings had ruled East Anglia for generations, and their legacy was at stake. Obligation to the people. Innocent civilians would suffer under Mercian conquest. Responsibility for the Christian establishments he had founded. Churches, monasteries, and schools would be destroyed or abandoned if Penda's pagan forces prevailed. Sigeberht's response demonstrated the depth of his commitment to the monastic life he had chosen. He refused, not tentatively or reluctantly, but with clear conviction. He had made vows that bound him to monastic stability and obedience. He had renounced worldly concerns precisely to escape the demands that were now being placed upon him. The kingdom would have to defend itself without him. Brother Sigeberht would not become entangled again in secular affairs. This refusal must have shocked the delegation. They had expected reluctance, perhaps initial resistance, but not this absolute rejection. Here was the kingdom's former ruler, a man whose wisdom and leadership were desperately needed, refusing to help in its moment of greatest crisis. The nobles pressed harder. They pointed out that his monastic vows did not have to be abandoned. He was not being asked to resume the throne or to exercise royal authority, merely to be present with the army to encourage the warriors. His refusal was not humility but selfishness, prioritizing his own spiritual comfort over the welfare of thousands of people who would suffer if East Anglia fell. Some members of the delegation may have become angry, their appeals turning to accusations. Was this the great Christian king they had heard so much about? A man who would abandon his people to save his own soul. What kind of Christianity was this, that valued personal piety more than communal welfare? Had all his talk of Christian love and charity been mere words, to be forgotten when actual sacrifice was required? But Sigeberht remained unmoved. He had thought deeply about these questions during his monastic years. He understood that he could not serve both God and the world. The choice he had made in entering the monastery was absolute. There could be no half measures, no temporary returns to worldly concerns. To leave the monastery, even for what seemed like compelling reasons, would be to admit that his monastic vows were negotiable, subject to revision whenever circumstances seemed to warrant it. The delegation returned to King Ecgric with the devastating news. Sigeberht would not help. The former king, who might have rallied the warriors and inspired them to heroic resistance, had chosen to remain in his monastery. The East Anglian army would have to face Penda's Mercians without the moral authority and inspiring presence that might have made the difference between victory and defeat. The response among the nobles and warriors was a mixture of shock, anger, and something like despair. Many felt betrayed. The king who had led them toward Christianity had now abandoned them when they needed him most. Others, particularly the remaining pagans, saw Sigeberht's refusal as confirmation that Christianity made men weak, unsuited for the harsh realities of survival in a violent world. But some, particularly those who had been closest to Sigeberht during his reign, understood his dilemma differently. They recognized that he was wrestling with profound spiritual questions about the nature of Christian commitment and the price of discipleship. His refusal, from this perspective, was not weakness, but a different kind of strength, the courage to maintain his commitment to a higher calling, even when worldly considerations seemed to demand compromise. As reports of Sigebert's refusal spread through the assembling army, the military situation became even more critical. Warriors who had been uncertain about their commitment to Egric's leadership now became more openly doubtful. Desertions began, first as a trickle, then with increasing frequency. Men slipped away from the camp, returning to their villages to evacuate their families before the Mercian storm arrived. The Mercian forces, meanwhile, were moving deeper into East Anglian territory. Penda's scouts would have reported the disarray in the East Anglian camp, the uncertainty of leadership, the declining morale. The Mercian king, experienced in reading such signs, would have pressed his advantage, moving to bring the East Anglians to battle before they could recover their equilibrium or receive reinforcements. King Egric found himself facing an impossible situation. His army was demoralized and shrinking through desertion. The Mercian force was larger, better motivated, and led by one of the most capable commanders of the age. The only factor that might have evened the odds, the inspiring presence of the beloved former king, had been definitively removed from consideration by Sigebert's refusal. Yet Egric could not simply surrender or flee. To do so would mean the end of East Anglian independence, the destruction of the Wuffinger dynasty, and quite possibly his own death. More than personal considerations were at stake. The welfare of thousands of people, the fate of the Christian establishments that had been built with such effort, the future of everything that Sigebert's reign had accomplished. In this desperate situation, the nobles made a decision that would have profound and tragic consequences. If Sigebert would not come voluntarily, he would be brought by force. The monastic vows that he considered sacred would be overridden by what they saw as a higher obligation, the duty to serve his people in their moment of greatest need. Brother Sigebert would return to the world whether he wished to or not. The expedition that set out for Beardrisesworth was not a delegation, but an armed party with clear instructions. They would not ask or persuade, they would compel. The spiritual violence of what they were about to do was understood by everyone involved, but military necessity had overridden such scruples. Sigebert's vows, his chosen calling, his spiritual well-being, all these were being sacrificed to what was perceived as the greater good of the kingdom's survival. The reluctant warrior, the scene at Beardrisesworth Monastery when the armed nobles arrived, must rank among the most painful moments in Anglo-Saxon history. Here was a company of warriors, desperate men facing possible annihilation, coming to seize a monk from his chosen sanctuary and drag him to a battlefield where he had no wish to be. Sigebert would have known immediately what was happening when he saw armed men approaching the monastery. Unlike the previous delegation, these warriors did not come to request, but to demand. Their faces would have shown not just determination, but a kind of anguished resolution. Men doing something they knew to be wrong, because they believed survival required it. The abbot and monks of Beardrisesworth would have attempted to intervene. The sanctity of monastic enclosure was not to be violated lightly. A man under monastic vows was, in a very real sense, dead to the world. His earthly ties severed, his worldly obligations ended. To forcibly remove him from the monastery was a kind of spiritual kidnapping, an assault on the sacred order that structured medieval life. But the nobles were beyond such considerations. They explained, probably with more urgency than eloquence, that East Anglia faced destruction. The army was demoralized. Warriors were deserting. Only Sigebert's presence could restore hope and fighting spirit. If the monastery's spiritual sanctity had to be violated to save the kingdom, then so be it. They would accept whatever spiritual consequences followed. But they would not watch East Anglia fall without using every possible resource. Sigebert's own reaction to this forced conscription reveals the depth of his spiritual commitment. According to the accounts that have survived, he did not resist physically. He did not call upon the monks to defend him, nor did he attempt to flee. But he made his objection clear through the most powerful symbolic protest available to him. He refused to bear arms. This refusal was not a tactical decision, but a theological statement. Sigebert had entered the monastery to pursue the heavenly kingdom, renouncing all attachment to earthly power and violence. To take up weapons now would be to acknowledge that his monastic vows were merely conditional, applicable only when convenient. By refusing weapons, he was maintaining his identity as a monk, even as he was being forced into the role of warrior. The journey from Beatriceworth to wherever the East Anglian army was assembled must have been agonizing for Sigebert. With every step, he was being pulled back into the world he had renounced, the peaceful rhythms of monastic life, the ordered offices of prayer, the quiet hours in the scriptorium, the simple routines of monastic work were receding behind him, replaced by the chaos and violence of military mobilization. The nobles who accompanied him tried to explain the military situation, perhaps hoping to engage his strategic thinking. They described Penda's movements, the disposition of forces, the tactical challenges they faced. But Sigebert, sources suggest, remained largely silent. What could he say? He had made his position clear. He believed this entire enterprise was wrong, a violation of his calling and his vows. He would comply with physical force, but he would not pretend to approve or enthusiastically participate. The arrival of Sigeberht at the East Anglian army camp created an immediate sensation. Warriors who had been preparing to desert suddenly reconsidered. The sight of their former king, even dressed in monastic habit rather than royal regalia, even obviously present against his will, nevertheless stirred something in the East Anglian soul. Here was the man who had brought learning and civilization to their kingdom, who had transformed East Anglia from a backwater to a centre of Christian culture. But Sigebert's very appearance also conveyed a troubling message. His monastic clothing, his refusal to wear armour or carry weapons, his evident unwillingness to be present, all these suggested that even this desperate measure might not be enough. The former king's body had been brought to the battlefield, but his heart remained in the monastery. King Ecgric faced a delicate challenge in incorporating Sigebert into the army's leadership structure. He could not simply restore Sigebert to command. The former king's refusal to bear arms made that impossible, and it would undermine Ecgric's own authority. But neither could he simply ignore Sigebert's presence. The entire point of bringing him was to inspire the warriors, and that required giving him some visible role. The compromise that emerged was awkward, but perhaps inevitable. Sigebert would accompany the army into battle, but in a symbolic rather than functional capacity. He would be present to inspire by his mere existence, to remind the warriors of what they were fighting for, but he would not exercise command or participate in the actual fighting. It was a role that satisfied no one. Not Ecgric, who wanted effective leadership, not the warriors, who wanted their beloved former king restored to full authority, and certainly not Sigebert, who wanted only to return to his monastery. The theological and spiritual dimensions of Sigebert's situation during these final days deserve careful consideration. Here was a man caught between competing moral obligations, each with powerful claims on his conscience. His monastic vows bound him to stability, obedience, and the pursuit of God through contemplative life. but his royal blood, his past responsibilities, and the desperate pleas of his people suggested that he had obligations to the wider community that could not simply be renounced. Medieval theology offered no clear resolution to such dilemmas. The monastic tradition emphasized the absolute nature of vows. They were solemn promises made to God, not merely human agreements that could be set aside when circumstances changed. But Christian ethics also emphasized the obligation to serve one's neighbor, to protect the innocent, to oppose evil and injustice. How was one to weigh these competing demands? Sigeberht appears to have resolved this dilemma by maintaining his monastic identity, even while being forced into a worldly situation. He would physically accompany the army, yielding to the compulsion that had been placed upon him. But he would not compromise his spiritual commitments by actively participating in violence. The staff he carried instead of a weapon was not just a practical alternative, but a symbolic declaration. I am a monk, not a warrior, even here on the battlefield. This staff that Sigeberht carried becomes, in the sources that describe his final hours, a powerful symbol of his entire life's journey. It was not the royal scepter of his kingship, symbol of earthly power and authority. Neither was it the sword of a warrior, instrument of violence and conquest. It was simply a staff, the walking stick of a pilgrim, the support of an old man, the humble tool of a shepherd. It declared that Sigeberht's true identity was that of a servant, a follower, a man whose strength came not from weapons, but from faith. The East Anglian warriors who saw their former king carrying only a staff must have had profoundly mixed reactions. Some would have been inspired by his spiritual courage. Here was a man who maintained his principles even in the face of death. Others would have been dismayed by what seemed like willful ineffectiveness. How could carrying a staff help them defeat the Mercians? Still others might have seen in Sigeberht's gesture a kind of prophecy, a recognition that this battle was already lost, that the staff was more appropriate than a sword because it better suited a man going to his martyrdom. As the Mercian and East Anglian armies moved toward their confrontation, the contrast between the two forces would have been stark. Penda's Mercians were confident, well-equipped, and led by a king at the height of his powers. The East Anglians were divided, uncertain, led by a king they only partially respected, and accompanied by a former king who carried only a staff, and whose presence was as much a sign of desperation as a source of inspiration. The location of the battle remains unknown to history. No surviving source identifies the specific site where Sigeberht would meet his end. It was probably somewhere along East Anglia's western frontier with Mercia, in territory that both kingdoms claimed or contested. The landscape might have been familiar to Sigeberht from his years as king. Perhaps rolling farmland, perhaps the edges of the great forest that still covered much of England, perhaps near one of the rivers that served as both highways and boundaries in Anglo-Saxon England. The night before the battle, for Anglo-Saxon armies typically fought during daylight hours, and there would have been a final night of waiting, must have been extraordinarily difficult for Sigeberht. Around him, warriors made their final preparations, checked weapons and armor, perhaps prayed to whatever gods or god they believed in. Some might have approached their former king, seeking a word of encouragement or blessing. Others might have avoided him, uncertain what to make of this monk warrior who carried a staff to battle. For Sigeberht himself, these hours would have been a time of intense spiritual wrestling. He faced probable death, but that was not his primary concern. Anglo-Saxon nobles understood that death in battle was an honorable end, and as a Christian, Sigeberht had the additional comfort of believing in resurrection and eternal life. What troubled him more deeply was the spiritual meaning of his situation. Had he been right to refuse to help voluntarily? Was his forced presence on the battlefield a violation of his monastic calling? Or had God permitted it for some purpose he could not yet understand? The prayers that Sigeberht offered during that final night would have been heartfelt and desperate, not prayers for military victory. That would have been inconsistent with his rejection of violence. Perhaps prayers for the souls of those who would die in the coming battle, both friend and foe. Prayers for the kingdom he had tried to build, now facing destruction. Prayers for his own soul, that whatever happened, he might remain faithful to the spiritual calling that had brought him to this impossible situation. As dawn broke on the day of battle, the East Anglian army began its final preparations. Warriors donned armour, checked weapons, and formed into the shield walls that were the basic tactical unit of Anglo-Saxon warfare. Commands were given, standards raised, war horns sounded. The complex machinery of early medieval battle was beginning to operate, moving inexorably toward the moment of contact, when shields would crash against shields and the work of death would begin. Sigeberht took his place with the army, though exactly where remains unclear from the surviving sources. He may have been near King Ecgric, his presence meant to inspire the troops around the king, or he may have been more centrally located, visible to as many warriors as possible. Wherever he stood, he would have been instantly recognizable, the only man in the entire army carrying a staff instead of a weapon, his monastic habit marking him as fundamentally different from everyone around him. The Mercian army, seeing the East Anglians formed for battle, advanced to meet them. Penda himself was probably at the forefront, leading by example as successful Anglo-Saxon war leaders typically did. His warriors would have been singing war songs, beating weapons against shields, creating the psychological warfare that preceded actual combat in this era. The noise would have been tremendous. Thousands of men shouting, metal clashing on metal, horns blowing, the sound designed to terrorize the enemy before a single blow was struck. And then the armies met. The final battle and martyrdom. The clash of shield walls was the defining moment of Anglo-Saxon warfare, the instant when two masses of armed men collided in a contest of strength, courage, and endurance. The front ranks would have thrust forward with shields, trying to break the enemy formation. Spears jabbed over and between shields, seeking vulnerable points in armor or unprotected flesh. Men pushed and shoved, the entire line swaying back and forth as each side struggled for advantage. For the East Anglian warriors, the first moments of battle must have been crucial for morale. Would they hold against the Mercian assault? Would Sigeberht's presence provide the inspiration they needed? The answer, tragically, appears to have been no. The Bede's account, though brief, suggests that the East Anglian line quickly began to falter. Multiple factors contributed to this collapse. The East Anglian army was smaller and had been demoralized even before battle began. The Mercians were better prepared, more confident, and led by a commander of proven ability. But perhaps most significantly, the symbolic presence of Sigeberht, which was supposed to inspire resistance, may actually have had the opposite effect. Seeing their former king with only a staff, obviously unwilling to fight, unable even to defend himself, may have suggested to the warriors that resistance was futile. In the chaos of battle, both King Ecgric and the former King Sigeberht were killed. The sources do not provide details of exactly how they died, but we can reconstruct the likely scenario. As the East Anglian line began to break under Mercian pressure, the area around the king would have become a focal point of fighting. Mercian warriors, recognizing the royal standard, or identifying Ecgric by his armor and position, would have pressed their attack. Ecgric, as an experienced warrior, would have fought to the end. He may have died weapon in hand, defending his position in the traditional manner of Anglo-Saxon war leaders. His death would have further demoralized the East Anglian army, as warriors saw their king fall and understood that the battle was lost. Sigeberht's death would have been different in character. Refusing to bear arms, unable or unwilling to defend himself, he would have been an easy target for Mercian warriors. Some sources suggest that Sigeberht was specifically targeted, perhaps by warriors who recognized him as the former king, or who were outraged by his presence on a battlefield carrying only a staff. The manner of Sigeberht's death transformed him, in Christian understanding, from failed king to holy martyr. He died maintaining his monastic commitment to non-violence even in the face of death. The staff that he carried instead of a weapon became, in retrospect, a symbol of his spiritual courage, the willingness to die rather than compromise his principles. The former scholar king, who had sought only to serve God in monastic peace, found his martyrdom on a battlefield he had never wanted to enter. The significance of Sigeberht's death carrying only a staff cannot be overstated. In Anglo-Saxon culture, where martial valor was the supreme virtue, where a warrior's identity was inseparable from his weapons, where songs celebrated men who died fighting to the last, Sigeberht's weaponless death was profoundly countercultural. It declared that there were values higher than survival, commitments more important than victory, and a form of courage that had nothing to do with martial prowess. For Christian observers, both at the time and in later centuries, Sigeberht's death fit perfectly into the pattern of martyrdom that had been established by early Christian saints. Like the martyrs who refused to sacrifice to pagan gods even under threat of death, Sigeberht had refused to compromise his spiritual commitments, even when survival depended on it. Like Stephen, the first Christian martyr, who was stoned to death while praying for his killers, Sigeberht had maintained his witness to the very end. The Mercian victory was complete. The East Anglian army was not merely defeated but destroyed. Those warriors who were not killed in the battle itself were cut down in the rout that followed. The standard pattern of Anglo-Saxon warfare saw relatively few casualties during the actual shield-wall combat, but massive slaughter during the pursuit of Étae, broken army. The East Anglians, fleeing in panic across unfamiliar territory, would have been easy prey for Mercian warriors eager for plunder and glory. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw Penda's forces ravaging East Anglian territory. Villages were burned, monasteries were plundered, and the Christian establishments that Sigeberht had worked so hard to build were destroyed or abandoned. The systematic Christianization that had been one of the great achievements of his reign was undone in a matter of weeks. Churches were torn down, priests fled or were killed, and the progress toward literacy and learning was brutally interrupted. The monastery at Nobbersberg, where Fursey had established his Irish mission, was attacked and the monks driven out. Fursey himself, along with his brothers Foillan and Ultan, fled to the continent, taking with them holy relics and whatever books they could carry. The first Irish monastic foundation in southern England was abandoned, and it would be years before monastic life was re-established there. Felix, the bishop whose partnership with Sigeberht had been so crucial to East Anglia's Christian transformation, survived the disaster, but must have watched in anguish as his life's work was destroyed. The schools were closed, the bishopric at Domok was disrupted, and the careful structures of Christian organization that had been built over the previous years collapsed under Mercian assault. But even in the midst of this destruction, the seeds of Sigeberht's legacy were being preserved. Stories of the scholar king, who had chosen the cloister over the crown, who had brought learning to his people, and who had died maintaining his spiritual principles even in the face of death. These stories were being told and remembered. Monks who fled carried these memories with them to other monasteries, where they would be written down and preserved. The body of Sigeberht was recovered after the battle, probably by Christian monks who risked their lives to provide proper burial for the martyred king. Unlike pagan burials, which often involved elaborate grave goods and warrior regalia, Sigeberht would have been buried in simple Christian fashion, his body oriented east toward Jerusalem, with minimal grave goods, in a location that would become a focus of Christian devotion. The site of Sigeberht's burial became important for the developing cult of his sanctity. Pilgrims began to visit, seeking the intercession of the Holy King, who had chosen heaven over earth. Miracles were reported, healings, visions, answered prayers, that confirmed in popular belief what Christian theology had already established. Sigeberht was a saint, a martyr whose witness to Christian principles had earned him a place among the blessed. The veneration of Saint Sigeberht began almost immediately after his death and spread throughout Anglo-Saxon England. His feast day was established in the church calendar, probably on the anniversary of his death, though the exact date was not preserved in surviving sources. Churches were dedicated to him, particularly in East Anglia, but also in other regions where his story became known. The cult of Saint Sigeberht served multiple purposes in Anglo-Saxon Christian society. For converts still uncertain about abandoning warrior values, his story demonstrated that Christian courage could manifest in forms other than martial valor. For monks struggling with the demands of their vocation, he provided an example of unwavering commitment to spiritual principles, even at the cost of earthly success or survival. For rulers wrestling with the relationship between Christian faith and royal power, he offered a model, albeit an extreme one, of what it meant to truly prioritize the kingdom of heaven over earthly kingdoms. The intellectual and educational legacy that Sigeberht left behind proved more durable than the immediate military and political situation might have suggested. Although the schools he founded were disrupted by the Mercian conquest, the idea of education as a royal responsibility had been established. Future Christian kings of East Anglia and other kingdoms would look to Sigeberht's example when founding their own educational institutions. The synthesis of Roman and Celtic Christianity that had been achieved during Sigeberht's reign, despite the trauma of the Mercian conquest, provided a model that would influence the development of English Christianity for centuries. The later Synod of Whitby in 664, which attempted to resolve tensions between Roman and Celtic practices, built upon the precedents established in East Anglia, where both traditions had coexisted and cooperated. The books and manuscripts that had been produced in Sigeberht's schools and monasteries, though many were destroyed in the Mercian invasion, had been copied and distributed to other monastic centres. The learning that Sigeberht had promoted thus survived, even when the institutions he founded were temporarily destroyed. Monasteries throughout England possessed copies of texts that had been produced or copied in East Anglia during the great flowering of Sigeberht's reign. The story of Sigeberht's abdication and martyrdom became a favourite subject for medieval writers and preachers. It appeared in saints' lives, in historical chronicles, and in homiletic literature. Each retelling emphasized slightly different aspects of the story, but all agreed on the central themes: the value of learning, the priority of spiritual over worldly commitments, and the courage required to maintain one's principles in the face of overwhelming pressure to compromise. For East Anglia itself, recovery from the Mercian conquest was slow but steady. King Ecgric was succeeded by Anna, another member of the Wulfinger dynasty, who worked to rebuild what had been destroyed. Anna continued Sigeberht's policies of supporting Christianity and promoting learning, demonstrating that the scholar king's vision had taken root deeply enough to survive even military catastrophe. The monasteries were gradually re-established. New churches were built, often on the sites of those that had been destroyed. The schools reopened, and once again, East Anglian children began learning to read and write. The work that Sigeberht had begun continued under new leadership, and the kingdom slowly recovered its position as a centre of Christian learning and culture. Bishop Felix, who outlived Sigeberht by more than a decade, witnessed this recovery and actively participated in it. His bishopric at Domok was restored. New priests were ordained to replace those who had been killed or had fled, and the missionary work of converting and educating the East Anglian people resumed. When Felix died around 647 or 648, having served as bishop for 17 years, the Christian foundation in East Anglia was strong enough to survive even his loss. The relationship between Sigeberht's martyrdom and the larger narrative of Anglo-Saxon conversion is significant. His death demonstrated that Christian commitment could require ultimate sacrifice, but it also showed that such sacrifice was not in vain. The learning and spiritual formation that he had promoted survived his death and continued to transform society. The staff that he carried instead of a weapon became a symbol not of weakness, but of a different kind of strength, moral courage, spiritual integrity, and unwavering faith. In later Anglo-Saxon literature and art, Sigeberht appears as one of a gallery of saint kings who demonstrated that royal power could be exercised in service of Christian values. Alongside figures like King Edwin of Northumbria, King Oswald, who succeeded him, and eventually King Edmund, who would be martyred by later pagan invaders, Sigeberht represented the ideal of Christian kingship, not as worldly success, but as faithful witness to divine truth. The paradox of Sigeberht's life and death was not lost on medieval theologians and writers. Here was a man whose greatest success came through apparent failure. As king, he had transformed East Anglia, but he had been unable to defend that transformation against military assault. As monk, he had sought only peace and contemplation, but he had been forced into the role of warrior. As scholar, he had valued learning and wisdom, but he had died in the chaos of battle. Yet through all these paradoxes and contradictions, he had maintained his integrity, and that integrity had transformed him from failed king to successful saint. Legacy of the Scholar King. The transformation of Sigeberht from historical king to legendary saint occurred within a generation of his death. This rapid canonization in popular devotion, for formal canonization procedures would not be established until centuries later, reflected the deep impression that his life and death had made on Anglo-Saxon consciousness. The essential elements of Sigeberht's sanctity were clear to his contemporaries. He had used royal power not for personal aggrandizement, but for the spiritual and intellectual elevation of his people. He had voluntarily abandoned that power to pursue a higher calling, and he had died maintaining his spiritual commitments, even when doing so meant certain death. These three aspects, wise use of power, renunciation of power, and martyrdom, created a narrative that resonated powerfully with Christian sensibilities. The educational legacy that Sigeberht established proved to be one of his most enduring contributions to English civilization. The schools he founded, though disrupted by the Mercian conquest, had demonstrated that Anglo-Saxons were capable of mastering Latin learning, and that literacy could extend beyond the clergy to include laypeople. This precedent would influence educational developments throughout the Anglo-Saxon period and beyond. The Venerable Bede, writing his ecclesiastical history of the English people in the early 8th century, approximately a century after Sigeberht's death, devoted significant attention to the Scholar King. Bede's account, though brief, established Sigeberht as a model of Christian kingship for future generations. His emphasis on Sigeberht's learning, his support for Felix and Fursey, his establishment of schools, and his ultimate martyrdom created a portrait of a ruler who understood that true greatness lay not in military conquest, but in cultural and spiritual achievement. The intellectual synthesis that Sigeberht promoted, the fusion of Anglo-Saxon traditions with Christian learning, the integration of Roman organizational principles with Celtic spiritual intensity, became characteristic of the Golden Age of Anglo-Saxon Christianity in the 7th and 8th centuries. The great scholars of this period, including Bede himself, Aldhelm of Malmesbury, and later Alcuin of York, all built upon foundations that Sigeberht had helped to establish. The monastic culture that flourished in England during these centuries bore Sigeberht's stamp in multiple ways. The emphasis on learning as a form of worship, the understanding that monasteries should be centers of education as well as prayer, the belief that Christian rulers had a responsibility to support intellectual and spiritual development, all these principles, which became central to Anglo-Saxon monasticism, had been demonstrated by Sigeberht's reign and monastic career. The political legacy was more complex. Sigeberht's abdication and martyrdom demonstrated the tension between Christian ideals and the practical requirements of rulership in a violent age. Could a Christian king maintain the spiritual principles of his faith while also providing the military leadership necessary to protect his people? Sigeberht's answer, that spiritual principles could not be compromised even for political necessity, was admirable, but also raised difficult questions about the responsibilities of Christian rulers. Later Anglo-Saxon kings grappled with this tension in various ways. Some, like Alfred the Great in the 9th century, managed to combine military effectiveness with scholarly pursuits and Christian piety, perhaps achieving the synthesis that Sigeberht had found impossible. Others leaned more heavily toward either the warrior or the scholar model, but all operated in a cultural context where Sigeberht's example had established that kingship involved intellectual and spiritual dimensions as well as military ones. The cult of Saint Sigeberht remained strong in East Anglia for centuries, the site traditionally identified as his monastery at Beadricesworth, the place that would later become famous as Bury St Edmunds, after another martyred king, became a centre of pilgrimage. Although St Edmund would eventually overshadow Sigeberht in popular devotion, the earlier Saint King was never forgotten. Churches throughout East Anglia bore his name, and his feast day continued to be celebrated in the regional liturgical calendar. The symbolic significance of Sigeberht's staff, the weapon that was not a weapon, continued to resonate through medieval literature and art. In an age that valued martial prowess highly, Sigeberht's refusal of arms represented a radical alternative understanding of courage and strength. The staff became, in Christian iconography, a symbol of spiritual authority that did not rely on violence, of power that came from faith rather than force. This symbolism took on additional meaning during the later Middle Ages, when the tension between temporal and spiritual power became a central concern of Christian political thought. Sigeberht's story was interpreted as demonstrating the superiority of spiritual over temporal authority. The king, who had wielded earthly power, had found it insufficient and had sought instead the power that came from complete dedication to God. His staff represented the pastoral rather than coercive model of authority, and his martyrdom, while carrying it, showed that such authority, though apparently weak, was ultimately stronger than any earthly force. The integration of Roman and Celtic Christian traditions that had been achieved during Sigeberht's reign provided a model that would influence English Christianity long after the specific institutional structures he established had disappeared. The Synod of Whitby in 664, when King Oswiu of Northumbria chose to follow Roman rather than Celtic practices regarding the date of Easter and other matters, might have been far more contentious had not the East Anglian example demonstrated that the two traditions could coexist and cooperate fruitfully. The literary legacy of Sigeberht's reign is difficult to trace with precision, but there are tantalizing hints that some of the earliest Anglo-Saxon Christian poetry may have been composed in the scriptoriums he established. The fusion of heroic Anglo-Saxon poetic traditions with Christian content, which became such a distinctive feature of Anglo-Saxon literature, required exactly the kind of cultural synthesis that Sigeberht promoted. Works like The Dream of the Rood, which reimagined the crucifixion in terms familiar from Germanic heroic poetry, might not have been possible without the groundwork laid in Sigeberht's schools and monasteries. The relationship between learning and sanctity that Sigeberht embodied became a recurring theme in Anglo-Saxon hagiography. Later saints' lives regularly emphasized the learning of their subjects, presenting scholarship not as separate from, but as integral to holiness. This emphasis on learned sanctity would be one of Anglo-Saxon Christianity's distinctive contributions to the wider medieval church. The missionary impulse that had brought Felix from Burgundy and Fursey from Ireland to Sigeberht's East Anglia would, within a century, reverse direction. Anglo-Saxon missionaries, trained in traditions established during Sigeberht's reign, would carry Christianity to pagan Germania. Figures like Boniface, the apostle to the Germans, were products of the educational system that Sigeberht had pioneered. The learning they brought to the continent, which would play a crucial role in the Carolingian Renaissance, had its roots in the synthesis of traditions that had been achieved in 7th century East Anglia. The theological significance of Sigeberht's martyrdom continued to be debated by medieval thinkers. Was his death truly martyrdom, since he died in battle rather than through direct religious persecution? The consensus that emerged was affirmative. Sigeberht had died maintaining his Christian commitment to non-violence, refusing to compromise his monastic vows even when survival depended on it. This was martyrdom in the truest sense, the ultimate witness to faith. The question of whether Sigeberht had been right to refuse to help his kingdom voluntarily, forcing his nobles to compel his presence, generated ongoing discussion. Some argued that his refusal demonstrated admirable commitment to his vows, but inadequate concern for the common good. Others maintained that his refusal was theologically correct. Monastic vows created obligations that superseded even urgent worldly needs. Still others suggested that the entire situation revealed the impossibility of fully reconciling Christian ideals with the brutal realities of Anglo-Saxon political life. The influence of Sigeberht's example extended beyond England. Continental scholars and churchmen, learning of the Anglo-Saxon king who had abandoned his throne to become a monk and had died rather than violate his monastic commitments, saw in him a model of Christian dedication that transcended cultural boundaries. References to Sigeberht appear in continental manuscripts, and his cult, though never as strong on the continent as in England, was not entirely unknown there. The architectural legacy of Sigeberht's reign is difficult to assess with precision, as most 7th century buildings have long since disappeared. However, archaeological evidence suggests that the churches and monasteries built during his reign established patterns that would influence later Anglo-Saxon religious architecture. The fusion of Anglo-Saxon building traditions with Christian spatial requirements, the adaptation of Roman architectural principles to northern materials and climate, and the development of distinctively English ecclesiastical forms all began during this period. The administrative innovations introduced during Sigeberht's reign, the use of written records, the establishment of schools to train literate administrators, the adaptation of Roman legal principles to Anglo-Saxon custom, laid groundwork for later developments in English governance. Although the full flowering of literate administration would not come until after the Norman conquest, the seeds were planted in Sigeberht's attempt to govern through wisdom rather than merely through force. The place of women in Sigeberht's educational vision is less clear from the surviving sources, but there are hints that his schools may have been more inclusive than was typical for the period. Several notable Anglo-Saxon women in the generation following Sigeberht demonstrated learning that suggests they had received formal education. The tradition of learned Anglo-Saxon noble women, which would produce figures like Hild of Whitby in the next generation, may have been initiated or encouraged by the educational developments of Sigebert's reign. The economic impact of Sigebert's Christian establishments continued long after his death. Monasteries, with their emphasis on agricultural improvement, record-keeping, and long-term planning, served as engines of economic development. The techniques introduced by continental and Irish monks, new crops, improved animal husbandry, hydraulic engineering for mill and fen drainage, gradually spread from monastic estates to the wider agricultural economy. The concept of royal responsibility for the spiritual welfare of the kingdom, which Sigebert embodied so thoroughly, became a defining feature of Christian kingship in England. Later, Anglo-Saxon kings, whatever their personal inclinations, understood that they were expected to support the church, promote learning, and attend to the moral and spiritual condition of their realms. This understanding of kingship would persist through the Middle Ages and influence the development of English political culture. The story of Sigebert's life and death became a popular subject for medieval preaching. Homilies on his feast day used his example to teach various lessons: the value of learning, the importance of keeping vows, the superiority of spiritual over worldly values, the nature of true courage, and the mystery of God's providence working through apparent failure. Different preachers emphasized different aspects of the story, but all found in it rich material for spiritual instruction. The paradox at the heart of Sigebert's legacy, that his greatest failure as king became his greatest success as saint, resonated deeply with Christian understandings of divine providence. His inability to defend his kingdom militarily, his forced removal from his monastery, his death carrying only a staff, all these apparent defeats were transformed by faith into spiritual victories. This pattern of transformation, of worldly failure becoming divine triumph, was central to Christian theology, and Sigebert's story illustrated it perfectly. The influence of Sigebert's example on later Anglo-Saxon monasticism was profound and multifaceted. The tension he experienced between worldly responsibility and spiritual calling became a recurring theme in monastic literature. Monks who were called to serve as bishops or advisors to kings could look to Sigebert's example for guidance on how to navigate the competing demands of contemplative life and active service. His ultimate choice, to maintain monastic identity even when forced into worldly affairs, provided a model for those who found themselves in similar situations. The relationship between the church and royal power that developed in post-Sigeberht East Anglia reflected lessons learned from his reign and martyrdom. Subsequent kings understood that they needed to support the church without attempting to control it completely, and church leaders learned that they required royal patronage without becoming entirely dependent on royal favour. This delicate balance, though never perfectly achieved, worked better in England than in many other medieval kingdoms, and Sigebert's example contributed to establishing its parameters. The educational philosophy that undergirded Sigebert's schools, that learning was valuable, not merely as practical training, but as a means of approaching God and understanding his creation, became characteristic of Anglo-Saxon intellectual culture. This approach saw no conflict between rigorous scholarship and deep piety, between mastery of classical learning and Christian faith. The great flowering of Anglo-Saxon learning in the 8th century, which produced scholars whose reputations spread throughout Christian Europe, built directly upon the foundations Sigebert had laid. The specific curriculum that had been developed in Sigebert's schools, beginning with basic Latin literacy and expanding to include theology, history, and even elements of the classical tradition, became a template for later Anglo-Saxon education. The balance between practical literacy, necessary for administration and liturgy, and more advanced learning, pursued for its own sake and for deeper understanding of Christian truth, reflected Sigebert's own intellectual formation in Gaul and his understanding of what his kingdom needed. The missionary strategy that had been pioneered during Sigebert's reign, bringing together Roman organizational effectiveness and Celtic spiritual intensity, adapting Christian practices to fit Anglo-Saxon cultural patterns, while also challenging and transforming that culture, proved remarkably successful. Later missions within England and eventually to the continent drew on these methods, demonstrating that Sigebert's approach had discovered principles of effective evangelization that transcended particular times and places. The artistic synthesis that began during Sigebert's reign, the fusion of Anglo-Saxon decorative traditions with Christian symbolic meaning, would reach its full flowering in later decades. The intricate interlaced patterns, the stylized animal motifs, the bold geometric designs that had decorated pagan Anglo-Saxon metalwork were adapted to serve Christian purposes in illuminated manuscripts, carved stone crosses, and liturgical objects. This distinctive insular art, which combined Germanic, Celtic, and Mediterranean influences, had its origins in the cultural fusion that Sigebert promoted. The liturgical developments that occurred during Sigebert's reign also had lasting impact. The blending of Roman liturgical practices brought by Felix with Celtic traditions introduced by Fursey created a rich and distinctive form of worship. The emphasis on elaborate liturgy, beautiful music, and ceremonial dignity that characterized Anglo-Saxon Christianity owed much to patterns established during this period. The daily office, celebrated with care and beauty in Sigebert's monasteries, became a defining feature of Anglo-Saxon monastic life. The concept of martyrdom that Sigebert's death embodied was somewhat different from earlier Christian understanding. Traditional martyrs had died refusing to sacrifice to pagan gods or to deny their faith under persecution. Sigebert died maintaining his commitment to monastic non-violence, refusing to bear arms even when doing so meant certain death. This expansion of martyrdom to include those who died maintaining Christian principles of life, not just Christian confession of faith, enriched the tradition and provided a model for later understanding of what it meant to witness unto death. The relationship between Sigebert's cult and the later, more famous cult of St. Edmund is complex and revealing. Edmund, king of East Anglia in the 9th century, was killed by pagan Vikings when he refused to share power with them or to renounce Christianity. His martyrdom in 869 created another royal saint for East Anglia, and his cult eventually overshadowed Sigebert's unpopularity. Yet the two cults were complementary rather than competitive. Both honored kings who had prioritized spiritual integrity over survival. Both demonstrated that Christian courage took forms different from traditional martial valor, and both reminded East Anglians that their kingdom had a heritage of sanctity as well as power. The geographical distribution of churches dedicated to Saint Sigebert reveals the extent of his cult's influence. While concentrated in East Anglia, as would be expected, dedications also appear in other regions of England, suggesting that his story resonated beyond his own kingdom. These scattered dedications indicate that Sigebert's example spoke to concerns and aspirations that were widespread in Anglo-Saxon Christian society. The preservation of Sigebert's story through the turmoil of the Viking invasions in the 9th century testifies to how deeply his example had taken root in English consciousness. When Danish armies swept through East Anglia, destroying monasteries and disrupting Christian life, the stories and traditions associated with St. Sigebert survived. Monks who fled carried these memories with them to safer locations, where they were eventually written down and preserved for future generations. The role of Sigebert's story in shaping ideals of Christian masculinity in Anglo-Saxon England deserves emphasis. In a warrior culture where masculinity was defined primarily through martial prowess, Sigeberht offered an alternative model: the learned man, the contemplative monk, the ruler who valued wisdom over warfare. This alternative was never going to completely displace traditional warrior values, but it provided space for men who did not fit the warrior mold to achieve respect and status through scholarship and piety. The diplomatic philosophy that Sigeberht had practiced during his active reign, building alliances through shared Christian faith, using learning and culture as tools of statecraft, seeking peaceful solutions to conflicts, influenced later Anglo-Saxon foreign policy. When Alfred the Great, in the late 9th century, created his own court school and sponsored translations of important texts into English, he was following a pattern that Sigeberht had established 2.5 centuries earlier. The theological interpretation of Sigeberht's life emphasized divine providence working through human choices and circumstances. His forced exile had led to the education that prepared him for kingship. His controversial decision to abdicate had led to the monastic life that gave him spiritual depth. Even his reluctant martyrdom had transformed apparent failure into eternal triumph. This narrative of God working through and despite human plans became a standard theme in Anglo-Saxon hagiography. The social impact of the literacy that Sigeberht promoted extended far beyond what he could have anticipated. As more people learned to read and write, the entire structure of Anglo-Saxon society began to shift. Written wills and charters began to supplement or replace oral traditions of inheritance. Legal proceedings started to involve written evidence. Personal letters became possible, creating new forms of relationship and communication. The transition from an entirely oral culture to one with significant written elements, which would take centuries to complete, began in earnest during Sigeberht's reign. The relationship between political power and spiritual authority that Sigeberht's life illuminated remained a central concern throughout the Middle Ages. His choice to abandon royal power for monastic life raised questions about the relative value of these two forms of authority. Was spiritual authority superior to temporal power? Could political leadership be a valid Christian calling? Or was withdrawal from worldly affairs the higher path? Different thinkers answered these questions differently, but Sigeberht's dramatic example ensured that the questions could not be ignored. The memory of Sigebert's schools and their role in transforming East Anglia influenced later educational foundations throughout England. When kings and nobles established schools in later centuries, they were consciously following Sigebert's precedent. The idea that education was a responsibility of Christian leadership, not just a specialty of monks, had been firmly established by his example. The integration of pastoral care with intellectual development that characterized Sigebert's approach to Christianization became a hallmark of English Christianity. Priests were expected to be not just liturgical officiants, but also teachers and counselors, combining learning with practical ministry. This integration reflected Sigebert's own combination of scholarly interests with deep concern for the spiritual welfare of his people. The architectural remains of Sigebert's reign are few, but archaeological work continues to reveal traces of the monasteries and churches built during his time. These physical remnants, supplemented by documentary evidence, show that 7th century East Anglian Christianity was creating a built environment that expressed and reinforced Christian values. Churches oriented toward Jerusalem, monasteries designed to facilitate communal prayer and work, schools built to accommodate the needs of teaching. All these represented the physical embodiment of Sigebert's vision. The manuscript tradition associated with Sigebert's scriptoriums has largely been lost, but occasional survivals or references in later texts suggest that these early East Anglian books were of high quality. The skills developed by scribes working under Sigebert's patronage would be passed on to subsequent generations, contributing to the golden age of insular manuscript production that would soon follow. The economic model of monastic self-sufficiency, combined with commercial engagement that developed during Sigebert's reign, influenced later monastic foundations. Monasteries were supposed to support themselves through agricultural production and craft work, but they also participated in regional and international trade networks. This balance between self-sufficiency and engagement with the wider economy proved sustainable and beneficial for both the monasteries and the surrounding communities. The emphasis on regular prayer that structured Sigebert's own monastic life became characteristic of Anglo-Saxon monasticism. More broadly, the 7 daily offices, beginning in the deep night with matins and concluding at sunset with compline, created a rhythm that sanctified time itself. This liturgical framework, maintained faithfully in monasteries throughout England, represented one of Sigebert's most enduring legacies to English spiritual life. The relationship between the cult of Saint Sigeberht and popular religion in Anglo-Saxon England reveals how Christian sanctity was understood and valued. Miracles associated with his relics and his shrine, healings, visions, answers to prayer, demonstrated that his holiness continued to affect the material world even after his death. Pilgrims seeking his intercession brought their most pressing concerns to his shrine, trusting that the scholar king, who had cared so deeply for his people's welfare in life, would continue to intercede for them from heaven. The literary treatments of Sigebert's story in later medieval texts show how his reputation evolved and was adapted to different contexts. Some versions emphasized his learning and cultural achievements, presenting him as a model of the scholar king. Others focused more on his renunciation of power, using his story to illustrate the superiority of spiritual over worldly values. Still others concentrated on his martyrdom, presenting him as a witness who maintained his principles even unto death. These varying emphases reflected the concerns and interests of different audiences and periods. The influence of Sigebert's example on the development of the English Church's relationship with continental Christianity was significant. His education in Gaul and his invitation of Felix from Burgundy demonstrated that English Christianity would not develop in isolation, but would maintain vital connections with the wider Christian world. This openness to continental influence, balanced with respect for indigenous traditions, represented by Fursey's Irish monastery, characterized English Christianity throughout the medieval period. The theological sophistication that developed in Sigebert's schools and monasteries laid groundwork for later English contributions to Christian thought, while the great Anglo-Saxon theologians like Bede would not appear until the next generation. They built upon foundations established during Sigebert's reign. The combination of rigorous biblical study, familiarity with patristic theology, and engagement with pastoral concerns that characterized Sigebert's own learning became typical of English theological work. The concept of Christian kingship that Sigebert embodied, seeing royal power as a form of service, prioritizing the moral and spiritual welfare of subjects, using authority to promote learning and culture, influenced how later Anglo-Saxon kings understood their role. Even kings who were primarily warriors, unlike the scholarly Sigebert, acknowledged that their responsibilities extended beyond military leadership to include support for religion, maintenance of justice, and promotion of the common good. The tension between contemplative withdrawal and active engagement that Sigebert experienced so acutely became a recurring theme in Christian spirituality. Monks throughout the medieval period grappled with questions about when it was appropriate to leave the monastery for active ministry, whether learning should be pursued for its own sake or primarily as preparation for service, and how to balance the demands of prayer with the needs of the wider community. Sigebert's example provided no simple answers to these questions, but it illuminated their complexity and importance. The legacy of collaboration between different Christian traditions that Sigeberht fostered, Roman and Celtic, continental and insular, episcopal and monastic, demonstrated that unity in essentials could coexist with diversity in practices. This model of unity in diversity, though often difficult to maintain, proved more fruitful than rigid uniformity would have been. The richness of Anglo-Saxon Christianity owed much to this willingness to draw on multiple traditions. The memorialization of Sigeberht through liturgy, art, and literature ensured that his example remained vivid for subsequent generations. Annual celebration of his feast day kept his story alive in popular memory. Artistic representations, in manuscript illuminations, carved stone, and later stained glass, made his story visually accessible. Homilies and saints' lives retold his story in ways that made it relevant to changing circumstances. Through all these means, the scholar king who chose the cloister continued to speak to the concerns and aspirations of English Christians centuries after his death. The transformation of Beodrisesworth into Bury St Edmunds, though it involved the eclipse of Sigeberht's cult by Edmunds, nevertheless preserved memory of the earlier saint. The monastery that Sigeberht had founded, though it would be known for Edmund, retained awareness of its origins in Sigeberht's abdication and monastic vocation. The layering of sanctity, one martyred king succeeding another as patron, created a depth of sacred meaning that made the site one of England's most important pilgrimage destinations. The scholarly tradition that Sigeberht established, though interrupted by Viking invasions and other disruptions, proved remarkably resilient. The commitment to learning, the understanding that education was a Christian duty, the belief that study of scripture and tradition could lead to deeper knowledge of God, all these survived the troubles that afflicted England in later centuries. The monastic revival of the 10th century, which restored and strengthened English monasticism after the Viking devastations, built consciously on traditions established in the 7th century, including those associated with Sigeberht. The political theology implicit in Sigeberht's choice to abandon the throne for the monastery raised questions about the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority that would occupy Christian thinkers for centuries. Was withdrawal from political power the higher calling? Or could Christian rulers serve God through wise and just governance? Sigeberht's own life suggested that both callings were valid, though he personally felt drawn more powerfully to the monastic path. This nuanced position, respecting both active service and contemplative withdrawal, became characteristic of Anglo-Saxon Christian thought. The martyrdom that Sigeberht achieved, though it came in circumstances he had tried desperately to avoid, completed the pattern of his sanctity. His life had demonstrated wisdom in governance, devotion in faith, and courage in renunciation. His death added the final element, witness unto blood, the ultimate testimony to the truth of what he believed. The staff that he carried instead of a weapon, which might have seemed like foolishness or weakness to pagan observers, became in Christian understanding the symbol of a profound spiritual truth, that the power of God is made perfect in human weakness. Closing reflection. As we reach the end of our journey through the life of Sigeberht of East Anglia, let us pause for a moment of quiet reflection on this remarkable soul, whose story has accompanied us through these peaceful hours. Here was a man born to power, who chose wisdom over warfare, a king who valued books more than treasure, and a ruler who ultimately found his truest calling not in a palace, but in a monastery. His story reminds us that greatness can take many forms, and that the courage to follow one's deepest convictions, even when the world demands otherwise, may be the highest form of bravery. Sigeberht's legacy lives on in ways he could never have imagined. Every time we value learning over violence, every time we choose principle over convenience, every time we recognize that spiritual integrity matters more than worldly success, We echo the choices he made in that distant 7th century. The schools he founded may have crumbled to dust. The churches he built may have vanished beneath the soil. But the idea he championed, that civilization is built not by the sword alone, but by wisdom, faith, and the patient work of education, continues to shape our world. The staff he carried into his final battle, that simple piece of wood that seems so inadequate against Mercian swords, stands as an eternal symbol. It reminds us that true strength comes not from the weapons we wield, but from the principles we refuse to abandon, not from the power we grasp, but from the convictions we maintain even unto death. And so we leave Saint Sigeberht, the scholar king, who chose the cloister, resting in the peace he sought so earnestly in life and found finally in death. May his example inspire us, may his wisdom guide us, and may his courage sustain us as we face our own struggles between worldly demands and spiritual callings. Thank you, dear sleepy listener, for joining me on this journey through time. If this tale has touched your heart or helped carry you toward peaceful rest, I would be so grateful if you would leave a gentle like and subscribe to join our growing family of dreamers here at Sleepy Crown. And please, don't be shy. Drop a comment letting me know what you thought, or suggest another historical figure whose story you'd love to hear told in this gentle way. Your presence here means more to me than you know. Sleep well, dear friend. May your dreams be peaceful, your rest be deep, and may you wake refreshed, carrying with you the gentle wisdom of the ages. Until we meet again in this cozy space where history and dreams intertwine. Good night and sweet dreams.